Tonight's story takes you on a long, quiet journey through one of the most dramatic chapters in American history. Across 15 gentle parts, we'll walk through the Civil War from beginning to end, not through loud battles or rushing drama, but through slow, steady moments that reveal the human side of the conflict. You'll hear about the causes that set the nation on different paths, the hidden networks of spies, the suffering inside prison camps, the fall of slavery from within, the slow turning of the tides, and the fragile work of rebuilding a broken country. This is a story filled with facts and small curiosities, details that often get overlooked, but presented at a calm, peaceful pace designed to help your mind unwind. Whether you love history, gentle storytelling, or simply drifting off to something meaningful, this journey is meant for you. Before we begin, welcome to History to Relax. I'm glad you're here. If you enjoy these long, peaceful history stories, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. Your message truly helps the channel grow, and I love seeing our quiet little community spread across different countries and time zones. Now, find a comfortable position. Take a slow breath in and let it out gently. The world outside can wait. This is your time to rest. Let your shoulders soften. Allow the day to fall away and settle into the quiet. The story begins now. Part 1. Seeds of Fire. The story of the American Civil War does not begin with a battlefield or a famous general. It begins decades earlier, inside the quiet rooms and restless thoughts of a young nation that could not decide what it wanted to be. When the United States declared itself born in liberty, it also carried the weight of deep contradictions. The same country that wrote stirring words about equality also kept hundreds of thousands of people in chains. That tension lived in its laws, its economy, and its most admired leaders. For a long time, the nation ignored it. But as the years passed, the conflict beneath the surface grew heavier, and each generation inherited a burden the one before it had tried to avoid. In the years after independence, Americans used phrases like freedom, opportunity, and self-government to describe their new identity. These ideas were powerful and sincere, yet they were never the whole truth. Many of the men most celebrated as the guardians of liberty participated in the system of slavery that denied liberty to others. Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men were created equal, yet over the course of his life, he owned more than 600 enslaved people. George Washington owned more than 100. Even leaders who disliked slavery personally still relied on it socially, politically, or economically. They saw themselves as men of their time, shaped by a world where slavery had existed for centuries. Some hoped the practice would fade. Others feared the consequences of removing it too quickly. The result was a nation built on two clashing visions of human rights. The differences between North and South did not appear suddenly. For decades, the two regions had been drifting apart. The North gradually shifted toward industry, wage labor, and growing cities. Factories filled with immigrants produced goods that traveled by rail and steamship. New England mills processed cotton from the South, turning raw fiber into cloth that fed a booming global market. The North was not free from racial prejudice or economic exploitation, but its development moved it away from plantation agriculture. The South followed a different path. Its wealth came from large plantations, fertile soil, and enslaved labor. Cotton became what many called white gold, and by the mid-1800s, it dominated the world market. Cotton exports funded the South, shaped its society, and strengthened the belief among plantation owners that their system would last forever. The prosperity of the region rested on the forced labor of millions of black men, women, and children who had no rights under the law. For wealthy Southerners, Questioning slavery was seen not only as a challenge to tradition, but as a threat to their entire economic structure. These differences grew sharper with each decade. New states entered the Union, and every addition forced the country to confront the same question. Would this new land be free or slaveholding? Politicians tried compromise after compromise, hoping to create a lasting peace. Each agreement delayed the crisis but solved nothing. The political system became a delicate balance, one that could tip dangerously with every election, every territorial expansion, or every Supreme Court decision. It was not only politics that deepened the divide. The two regions developed contrasting cultures and views of the future. Many in the North believed the country should keep modernizing and moving toward a free labor system. They saw wage work, education, and industrial growth as paths toward progress. Many in the South felt that the North did not understand their way of life. They believed their traditions were older, more stable, and more rooted in honor and land. They feared that any interference from the North would damage their society beyond repair. Between these two worlds stood the enslaved population. Their voices rarely appeared in political debates, yet they shaped the nation in ways few acknowledged at the time. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways. Some escaped, some sabotaged tools, some educated themselves in secret, and many held tightly to their families and communities despite constant threat. Their presence challenged the country's self-image, revealing the gap between its ideals and its reality. As the 19th century progressed, anti-slavery movements grew louder. Abolitionists argued that slavery was a moral crime that should end immediately. Some worked through newspapers and speeches, while others risked their lives on the Underground Railroad. Their ideas spread slowly at first, then more rapidly. They were not the majority, but they were persistent. Southern leaders viewed these voices as dangerous radicals. Northern politicians tried to calm the tension by urging patience. Yet, by the 1850s, patience was no longer possible. New events pushed the nation closer to crisis. The fugitive slave laws required citizens across the country to help capture people escaping from slavery. This forced many Northerners who had not taken a position to confront the realities of the system. Families saw neighbors taken away in chains. Tensions rose in courtrooms, towns, and state legislatures. Moments that once might have passed quietly now caused uproar. At the same time, violent confrontations broke out in the West. Settlers in new territories fought, voted, and often spilled blood over whether their future would include slavery. These events, later known as Bleeding Kansas, shocked the country. Newspapers published dramatic stories that deepened mistrust between North and South. Each side read the same accounts but interpreted them as evidence of the other's aggression. Even the highest levels of government could not escape the growing conflict. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision declared that Black Americans had no rights under the Constitution and that Congress could not restrict slavery anywhere. This ruling deepened the belief among many Northerners that the system was spreading, not shrinking. It also convinced many Southerners that the law protected slavery more firmly than ever. Instead of calming tensions, the decision magnified them. All of these pressures led into the strange, fractured election of 1860. 4 candidates ran for president, each representing a different vision of America's future. Abraham Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state and without earning even half the national vote. His victory revealed how divided the country had become. Within weeks, Southern leaders declared that they no longer wished to remain in the Union. Secession conventions debated, voted, and issued documents that made their intentions clear. They believed their rights and way of life were threatened. They feared the future more than they trusted the federal government. For many Americans, the speed of events was shocking. Families debated fiercely around dinner tables. Newspapers argued about what would happen next. There was confusion, hope, fear, and disbelief all at once. Some people assumed the crisis would settle through negotiation. Others expected a peaceful separation. Only a few imagined a long and devastating war. The months between Lincoln's election and his inauguration felt suspended in time. The country existed in two realities at once. One nation still functioned under the old structure. The other, in the South, formed a new government, wrote a new constitution, and prepared for independence. Leaders tried to avoid military conflict, but mistrust grew too deep. By spring of 1861, the final threads holding the Union together were fragile and worn. It was during these months that the true weight of the nation's contradictions became impossible to ignore. The promises of the past had collided with the realities of the present. A country founded on liberty had not resolved the question of who that liberty was meant to include. The North and South had become two regions with different economies, different priorities, and different visions of justice. The attempts to reconcile these differences had stretched across decades, but the gap had grown too wide. The seeds of conflict had been planted long before. They lay in early compromises that postponed moral reckoning. They lived in the decisions of leaders who hoped future generations would find answers. They grew in the fields of the South, where cotton profits expanded slavery rather than shrinking it. They appeared in the factories of the North, where the economic system drifted further from plantation life. Every event, law, and argument added weight to the delicate balance. By 1861, the burden had become too great. The Civil War would not begin because of a single moment. It would begin because of many. Hidden tensions, unresolved debates, political miscalculations, and moral contradictions had woven themselves into the nation's identity. When the first shots finally echoed across the harbor at Fort Sumter, they did not cause the war. They revealed it. The conflict had been building for generations. The gunfire merely announced that it could no longer be postponed. In the quiet days before the war truly began, Americans stood on the edge of something they could not fully understand. Some sensed danger. Others believed the conflict would be brief and decisive. Almost no one imagined the scale of the sacrifice ahead. The war that would reshape the nation had already taken shape in its history, its contradictions, and its choices. And now, as the story continues, we step with them into a world about to fracture. Part 2. A Nation Splits. The America that stepped into the election year of 1860 was restless and uneasy. Conversations in town squares, newspapers, state legislatures, and family homes circled the same question. What would happen if the differences between North and South could no longer be held together? Every region sensed that something important was approaching, though almost no one could predict its shape. Many believed compromise would continue, as it always had. Others feared the next decision made in Washington would tip the balance so far that no agreement could restore it. The political world was already strained. Parties that once dominated national politics were falling apart. Old alliances no longer made sense in a country that had changed too quickly. The Whig Party had collapsed earlier in the decade. The Democrats, once the strongest national party, had split into northern and southern branches. New political movements rose from the confusion, each claiming to represent the future. The most successful among them was the Republican Party, still young, still defining itself, and growing rapidly in states where slavery was losing influence. As the presidential race took shape, the country found itself with not 2, but 4 candidates on the ballot. Each man represented a different vision of what the United States should become. Abraham Lincoln, leading the Republicans, believed that slavery should not expand westward into new territories. He did not call for immediate abolition everywhere, but he insisted that the nation could no longer pretend that the issue was settled. Stephen Douglas, running as a Northern Democrat, supported the idea that each territory should decide the slavery question through popular vote. John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, argued that slavery had to be protected by federal law, and John Bell, the candidate of the Constitutional Union Party, focused almost entirely on maintaining the Union, hoping to avoid the deeper questions altogether. It was one of the most unusual elections in American history, with 4 campaigns moving in separate directions. The number of candidates revealed how fractured the country had become. In many southern states, Lincoln's name did not appear on the ballot at all. Large parts of the region rejected his candidacy so completely that voters had no opportunity to choose him. Meanwhile, in the North, the Republican Party had gained impressive strength, especially among voters troubled by the spread of slavery into new territories. When the votes were counted, the results reflected the division rather than unity. Lincoln won the presidency with just under 40% of the popular vote, but he carried a strong majority of the electoral votes because his support was concentrated in the North and West. Breckinridge and Douglas had split the Democratic vote, while Bell carried several border states. Although Lincoln won decisively in the electoral system, his popular support was narrow and sharply regional. It became clear to many Americans that the nation had become 2 political worlds sharing the same map, but no longer sharing the same direction. The shock of Lincoln's victory was immediate in the South. Leaders in several states had warned that they would leave the Union if a Republican won. Now that moment had arrived. South Carolina acted first. Only weeks after the election, its convention voted to secede, declaring that the bond between them and the federal government was broken. Their official document explained that they felt threatened by a president who opposed the extension of slavery and by a government they believed favored Northern interests. They saw secession not as rebellion, but as a necessary act of self-preservation. Other states soon followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas called conventions and repeated the same decision. Together, they formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. Their delegates met in Montgomery, Alabama, and created a constitution that closely resembled the original United States Constitution, but with clear protections for slavery. They selected Jefferson Davis as their president, believing he represented the honor and principles they wished to defend. The process happened gradually but swiftly, like a series of doors closing one after another. Many people across the South supported the decision, convinced that the federal government had grown hostile to their way of life. Others felt deep uncertainty. Some believed secession was too extreme, too risky. Small farmers, merchants, and many ordinary families saw the growing tension, but did not always understand how the decisions of politicians would shape their future. Letters from those months reveal fear, pride, confusion, and hope. Emotions layered together in ways that reflected how complex the moment truly was. The North watched these developments with alarm and disbelief. Many Americans did not initially believe secession would be permanent. They assumed a compromise or negotiation would restore the Union. Others felt the South had acted too quickly, and that patience might still solve the crisis. Newspapers filled their pages with predictions, warnings, and calls for restraint. Even Abraham Lincoln, still weeks away from taking office, tried to calm the situation through public statements. He repeated that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. His goal, he said, was simply to keep the nation together. Yet these words did little to settle the fear spreading across the South. By the time Lincoln reached Washington in early 1861, 7 states had already formed a new government. Their leaders believed separation was the only way to protect their political power and their slave-based economy. They argued that Northern pressure would only increase and that secession was a final defense against a future they did not want. In the North, Lincoln's election brought relief to those who opposed the spread of slavery and hoped for a new direction in national politics. But even many who disliked slavery believed that secession was far more dangerous. To them, the Union was not just a political arrangement. It was a symbol of American identity, a living experiment in self-government. If states could leave whenever they disagreed, then the nation might dissolve entirely. Lincoln believed strongly in this idea. In his mind, the Union was older than the Constitution itself. It was a bond formed in revolution, strengthened through struggle, and meant to endure. In the months between the election and the inauguration, the United States existed in a kind of in-between state. No war had begun yet, but the Union was already broken. Federal forts in the South faced growing pressure. Armories, military posts, and supply depots were being seized by new Confederate authorities. Washington tried to avoid confrontation, but nearly every attempt to negotiate failed. Leaders could not even agree on whether secession was legal, let alone on how to respond to it. The most symbolic of these disagreements focused on Fort Sumter, located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort was still held by Union troops, even though South Carolina had declared itself no longer part of the United States. Supplies inside the fort were running low. Confederate officers demanded its surrender. The federal government insisted it must remain under Union control. Diplomacy stalled. Neither side wanted to appear weak. Both sides understood that whatever happened at Fort Sumter would send a message to the entire country. While leaders struggled, daily life for ordinary Americans shifted quietly. Trade routes changed. Postal services broke apart. Banks worried about loans made across state lines. Soldiers in the South faced choices about loyalty. Northern families wondered whether their sons would soon be called to military service. The separation reached into every corner of society, often in small but meaningful ways. It was not only political disagreements that shaped this period. The emotional landscape was equally important. Many Southerners believed they were defending a tradition that gave them identity and purpose. Many Northerners felt they were protecting the promise of the American experiment. These feelings deepened the divide more than any law or speech could. A country built on shared ideals had begun to lose sight of its shared identity. As the final days of winter approached in 1861, the tension sat heavy in the air. No one could predict what the next decision would bring. Lincoln's arrival in Washington was surrounded by concern for his safety, as threats circulated widely. The atmosphere in the capital was thick with uncertainty. Some believed the crisis might still be resolved peacefully. Others thought war was unavoidable. Every conversation seemed to circle the same questions. Who would give in? Who would act first? And what would happen when they did? When Lincoln delivered his inaugural address, he spoke with calm determination. He appealed to the South, promising not to interfere with slavery where it existed. But he also stated clearly that secession was unlawful and that the Union would be preserved. His message was gentle in tone, but unwavering in principle. He hoped reconciliation might still be possible. He also made it clear that the federal government would defend its authority. The South heard the speech differently. Many people felt Lincoln's words confirmed their fears. They believed he would restrict their future and that his presence in the White House threatened the foundation of their society. Newspapers printed interpretations that fueled suspicion. Public meetings called for unity behind the new Confederacy. Communities organized militias. The early months of 1861 were filled not only with political maneuvering, but also with public emotion and rising pride. By the start of spring, the situation could no longer be contained. The country stood at the edge of a transformation it did not fully understand. The separation had moved beyond speeches and declarations. It had become physical, real, and immediate. Federal forts were surrounded. Confederate troops were mobilizing. Washington and Montgomery watched each other with increasing tension. The Union had not vanished, but it had fractured in ways that could not be easily repaired. The split was complete, yet the conflict had not formally begun. The two sides believed they held the truth of what America should be. They believed the future depended on their success. Each side waited for the other to make the first move, knowing that once it happened, there would be no turning back. The months between Lincoln's election and the first gunfire revealed how deeply the nation had changed. They showed a country where political arguments had become personal, where old compromises no longer worked, and where fear and pride pushed communities apart. These months did not create the war, but they made it inevitable. In the quiet before the storm, Americans carried a sense of uncertainty that touched every part of life. A union that once seemed unbreakable now appeared fragile. The hopes of the past and the fears of the future collided in a moment that would soon reshape everything. And so the nation waited, suspended between peace and conflict, with the understanding that the next decision might set history in motion. Part 3. The First Shots. The first months of 1861 unfolded with a quiet tension that seemed to settle over the entire country. It was not the loud, chaotic kind of tension that fills a battlefield, but something slower, heavier, and more uncertain. Americans sensed that a serious test was coming, yet no one knew when or where it would break open. The Union and the new Confederate government watched one another with deep suspicion, waiting for a single action that might force the next step. The atmosphere carried the feeling of a long breath held too long, as though the entire nation waited for the moment it would finally have to release. At the center of this growing pressure stood a single fort made of brick and granite, surrounded by seawater and uncertainty. Fort Sumter, located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, became a symbol for both sides. To the Union, it represented federal authority. To the Confederacy, it represented a threat to the independence they believed they had claimed. Each side convinced itself that control of the fort would determine the nation's direction. Neither wished to surrender it. Neither wished to appear weak. Major Robert Anderson commanded the Union garrison inside Fort Sumter. His men were outnumbered and undersupplied. Their presence in the fort was more symbolic than strategic, yet symbolism mattered deeply at this moment. Anderson was a loyal officer who wanted to follow orders without provoking violence. He knew the men under his command were placed in a difficult position. Supplies dwindled with each passing week. Food became more limited. Ammunition was conserved. Requests for more provisions met delays and disagreements in Washington. Many in the capital hoped that diplomacy might still resolve the situation. Anderson, stationed in the harbor, saw how unlikely that hope was becoming. The Confederate leadership in Charleston faced its own complications. They believed the fort belonged to them now, because South Carolina had left the Union. Yet removing the Union soldiers by force carried consequences they could not fully predict. They tried negotiations, but Anderson refused to abandon his post without orders from Washington. Confederate officials, convinced that time worked against them, increased pressure. Batteries along the harbor were strengthened. Troops drilled and prepared. Every day brought new developments that made the atmosphere more fragile. Meanwhile, in other parts of the country, life continued with a strange mix of normalcy and expectation. The winter months gave way to early spring. Farmers prepared their fields. Merchants continued their trade. Families read newspapers filled with speculation and warnings. Some still hoped the crisis might pass with little violence. They believed that reason would prevail, or that cooler heads would find a way to step back from the brink. Others saw the conflict as inevitable. They recognized that the two sides had drifted too far apart for a peaceful solution. In Washington, President Lincoln faced an impossible decision. He could order supply ships to resupply Fort Sumter, risking confrontation. He could withdraw the garrison, allowing the Confederacy to claim victory and solidify its position. Both choices carried serious consequences. Lincoln believed that abandoning the fort would signal weakness and might encourage more states to secede. Yet he also feared that sending reinforcements might provoke a fight. The new president, still settling into office, understood that the nation's future rested on decisions made in those early weeks. Lincoln's cabinet debated every option. Some urged caution, hoping to avoid open conflict. Others insisted that the Union could not appear divided. Lincoln listened to each argument carefully, weighing risks against principles. Finally, he decided to notify the governor of South Carolina that a ship would sail to the fort with food and supplies. He emphasized that the mission was not intended to bring additional troops or weapons. The resupply would be peaceful, unless Confederate forces chose otherwise. This message placed the decision in Confederate hands. They now had to determine whether they would allow a peaceful resupply or respond with force. Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, understood that the moment had arrived when clear choices had to be made. Allowing the resupply would weaken their claim to independence. Refusing it would challenge the federal government openly. An attack would mean war. The weight of this decision was enormous, and the leaders of the new Confederacy debated it intensely. On the morning of April 12, 1861, the long period of waiting finally came to an end. At 4:30 a.m., Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter. The dark sky over the harbor filled with flashes of light. Smoke curled upward as shells crossed the water. The first shot did not strike the fort. It arched into the sky as a signal, marking the beginning of the bombardment. It is said that some Charleston residents watched from balconies and boats, witnessing the moment when their world crossed a line it could not retreat from. Inside the fort, Anderson and his men took their positions. They returned fire, but their situation was already difficult. Confederate cannons surrounded the harbor, giving them little chance to mount an effective defense. The attack continued throughout the day, each blast shaking the walls of the fort. Anderson's men worked steadily, controlling flames and conserving ammunition. They were not yet fighting a battle in the traditional sense. They were simply trying to endure. Despite the intensity of the bombardment, there were no casualties during the battle itself. The fort's structure helped shield the men, though the danger was clear. As the hours passed, fires burned inside the walls. Supplies were even more limited than before. Anderson recognized that the situation could not continue indefinitely. On April 13th, after 34 hours of bombardment, he agreed to surrender the fort. A formal ceremony followed as the Union garrison lowered its flag and marched out. The Confederacy took control of Fort Sumter, marking their first major victory. Although the battle caused no death during the exchange of fire, the consequences were immediate and profound. The news spread across the country with remarkable speed. Newspapers printed extra editions. Towns held public meetings. Politicians delivered speeches filled with urgency. For many Northerners, the attack on Fort Sumter crossed a clear line. It signaled that the Confederacy was willing to use force to break the Union. For many Southerners, the capture of the fort confirmed their belief that separation was possible and necessary. The brief battle marked the beginning of a conflict that would shape the country in ways few understood at the time. President Lincoln responded quickly. He called for 75,000 volunteers to restore federal authority in the states that had left the Union. His appeal stirred the country. Young men answered the call with enthusiasm, gathering in towns and cities to enlist. Communities organized their own regiments, each proud to represent their state. The atmosphere in the North shifted from uneasy tension to determined action. People who had hoped the crisis would pass now accepted that the Union must defend itself. The reaction in the South was equally intense. 4 additional states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, decided to join the Confederacy after Lincoln's call for troops. They believed they could not take up arms against their neighboring states or the Southern way of life. Their decision expanded the Confederacy's boundaries and brought new resources and manpower into the conflict. The line between North and South became clearer, stretching across mountains, rivers, and countless small towns where families carried different loyalties. As the country organized itself for war, an unexpected mixture of emotions filled the air. Many young men on both sides believed the fight would be short. They expected a few decisive battles that would settle the question and allow them to return home. Parades were held, flags were raised, bands played patriotic songs. The war began with a strange sense of excitement, as though the coming conflict might resemble an adventure rather than a tragedy. Yet beneath the enthusiasm lay a growing unease. Older citizens remembered the cost of earlier wars and warned that battles rarely unfold as simply as people expect. Some families were divided, with brothers choosing different sides. Ministers preached about duty and sacrifice. Politicians gave speeches filled with confidence, while privately worrying about the scale of the conflict ahead. As the spring unfolded, armies formed on both sides. Camps filled with volunteers learning to march, drill, and handle weapons. Communities donated blankets, clothing, and food. Women sewed uniforms and gathered supplies. The transformation from a divided nation to a nation at war happened with remarkable speed. The first major confrontation came near Manassas, Virginia, in July 1861. Civilians traveled from nearby towns to watch, believing they might witness a brief and decisive moment. They brought picnic baskets, blankets, and children, unaware that what they were about to see would reveal the true nature of war. The battle began with confusion, smoke, and noise. As the day progressed, the intensity of the fighting shocked everyone present. Soldiers struggled in the heat. Officers shouted orders to men who could barely hear them. Lines broke apart and reformed. Cannon fire echoed through the fields. When the Confederacy gained the upper hand, Union troops began to retreat. What had begun as a confident display of strength turned into a disorganized fallback. The roads became crowded with soldiers, civilians, and carriages. The battlefield revealed itself not as a spectacle, but as a place of fear and chaos. The first battle of Bull Run ended with a clear message. The war would not be quick, clean, or easy. News of the battle spread rapidly, shaking both North and South. Each side realized that the conflict would demand more than enthusiasm and speeches. The war required organization, resources, discipline, and a seriousness that neither side fully possessed at the start. Leaders began to adjust their strategies. Citizens recognized that the road ahead would be long. The early months of the Civil War were marked by a mixture of hope, misunderstanding, pride, and fear. The first shots at Fort Sumter did more than mark the beginning of hostilities. They shattered the illusion that the nation could resolve its divisions through patience alone. The capture of the fort, the call for volunteers, and the first major battle all revealed a deeper truth. The United States had entered a conflict that would reshape the lives of millions. Through these events, the war transformed from a political dispute into a human struggle with real consequences. Soldiers left their homes. Families stood uncertain. Leaders planned for battles they could not yet imagine. And throughout the country, an awareness settled in, a recognition that the conflict had moved beyond speeches and declarations. It had become a defining moment in the nation's history. The early days of the war showed how quickly a country could shift from hesitation to action. They revealed how deeply people cared about the future of the Union or the independence of the Confederacy. They also hinted at the challenges still to come, challenges far more difficult than anyone yet understood. Part 4. Soldiers of the Blue and Grey. When the Civil War began, the armies that marched into the conflict were not made of long-trained professionals. They were made of ordinary people. Farmers, teachers, clerks, carpenters, and young men who had barely finished school gathered under new regimental flags. In the north and the south, the first wave of volunteers reflected the diversity of the country, as well as its contradictions. They came from cabins, towns, cities, and farms. Many enlisted with enthusiasm, believing the war would be short. Others joined out of obligation or fear of being left behind. Some felt a deep sense of duty to their state or country. A few enlisted because they had nowhere else to go. The Union Army, representing the North, drew heavily from states with growing populations and large immigrant communities. Many units contained men who had arrived in the United States only a few years earlier. Entire companies spoke German, Irish, or Scandinavian languages among themselves. Some had fled famine, political turmoil, or poverty in Europe, only to find themselves fighting in the fields and forests of America. Their reasons for joining were a mixture of opportunity, loyalty, and necessity. For many, the army offered steady pay, food, and a sense of belonging they had struggled to find elsewhere. The Confederate Army, representing the South, relied on a different collection of men. Most Southern volunteers were farmers or laborers who had grown up in rural communities. Their letters reveal how deeply connected they felt to the land and to their families. Many believed they were defending their homes rather than fighting for abstract political principles. Wealthy plantation owners often served as officers, while poorer white men filled the ranks. Their motivations were shaped by community expectations, personal honor, and the belief that their world was under threat. Most had never traveled far from home. The idea of marching across states and facing unfamiliar environments felt both intimidating and strangely exciting. Despite the differences between the two armies, the individual soldiers shared many of the same experiences. They quickly discovered that military life was far less glamorous than the parades and speeches that encouraged them to enlist. Camps were crowded and uncomfortable. Tents offered little protection from rain or cold. Food was often simple and repetitive. Drills lasted for hours under harsh weather. Days blended into one another, marked by the sound of bugles and the voices of officers giving instructions. Many soldiers entered the war with little understanding of what they would face. They imagined battles filled with quick, heroic actions and clear distinctions between victory and defeat. The reality was much slower and more demanding. Before the first major campaigns, most of their time was spent learning how to march in formation, load a rifle properly, build fortifications, and follow commands. The routines felt endless, but they were necessary. Commanders knew that untrained troops would break easily under fire. Discipline and repetition, though tedious, were essential for survival. Life in camp revealed many aspects of the soldiers' personalities and backgrounds. Some men adapted quickly and found comfort in the predictability of military life. Others struggled with the rules and restrictions. Letters from these early months describe boredom, homesickness, and occasional humor. Soldiers passed the time playing cards, writing to loved ones, carving wooden trinkets, or listening to fellow troops read newspapers aloud. They formed friendships that would become central to their survival. In an environment filled with uncertainty, companionship became a source of strength. Meals in the camps were simple and often unpleasant. Union soldiers received rations that included hardtack, a dry, tough biscuit that could last for years, salted meat, beans, and coffee. Confederate soldiers received similar rations, though shortages became more common as the war progressed. Fresh vegetables were rare, meat often spoiled. Soldiers found creative ways to make meals more tolerable, mixing ingredients together or cooking over makeshift campfires. Coffee became a treasured comfort for the Union troops, while Confederate soldiers, lacking access to imported beans, brewed substitutes made from roasted acorns or chicory. Clothing varied widely. Union soldiers wore dark blue uniforms issued by the federal government. Early in the war, These uniforms were inconsistent in quality, but they improved with time. Confederate uniforms were far less standardized. Some soldiers wore gray, others button-up brown, and many began the war in their civilian clothes. The lack of uniformity occasionally led to confusion on the battlefield, particularly during the first months when both sides were still learning to identify one another. As the conflict continued, supply shortages forced Confederate troops to mend their clothing repeatedly or scavenge from abandoned Union supplies. One of the most striking features of the Civil War armies was the wide range of ages among the soldiers. Boys as young as 14 managed to enlist by claiming to be older. Some served as drummers or buglers, while others fought directly in the ranks. At the other end of the spectrum were men in their 50s and even 60s who believed it was their duty to serve, despite the physical demands. These older volunteers often took on support roles, but many fought in battle when needed. Their presence revealed how deeply the war reached into every generation. The motivations that led men to enlist varied, but once they joined, they soon realized that the war demanded more than patriotism or excitement. Training exposed their weaknesses. Long marches tested their endurance. Illness swept through camps with alarming speed. Diseases such as measles, dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia spread quickly in crowded conditions. Many soldiers fell sick before they ever saw a battlefield. The lack of sanitation, limited medical knowledge, and contaminated water made camps more dangerous than early skirmishes. Letters home often described fear of disease more than fear of combat. Despite these hardships, many soldiers found meaning in their service. They wrote proudly about their regiments, shared stories of camaraderie, and expressed hopes that their efforts would shape the future of the country. Their letters reveal moments of quiet reflection, humor, and resilience. Some wrote poems or kept journals, recording their thoughts as they waited for the next order. These personal writings offer glimpses into their inner lives, their doubts, hopes, and fears, showing the human side of a conflict that would define their lives. Daily routines in camp created a rhythm that helped soldiers endure long periods of inactivity. They woke early, stood in formation, completed chores, practiced drills, and performed guard duty. Nights were quieter but unsettled. Many soldiers slept lightly, listening to the sounds of insects, wind, distant fires, or the footsteps of guards. They often talked long into the night, sharing memories of home or imagining the battles ahead. These conversations strengthened their bonds and helped them confront the uncertainty of their situation. When soldiers finally experienced battle, their understanding of the war changed instantly. The first gunfire, the sharp crack of rifles, the thunder of artillery, and the heavy clouds of smoke created an environment unlike anything they had imagined. Many described their first experience of combat as overwhelming, confusing, and disorienting. Commands became difficult to hear. The battlefield filled with noise and movement. Smoke reduced visibility. Men acted on instinct and training, relying on their officers, their comrades, and the lessons learned in camp. The emotional impact of battle lingered long after the fighting ended. Soldiers who survived often described a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and sorrow. They saw the cost of war more clearly after each confrontation. The excitement that had accompanied their enlistment faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of sacrifice. They carried memories of each battle with them, knowing that the next confrontation could arrive at any moment. One remarkable truth about Civil War soldiers is how young many of them were. The average age was around 25, yet large numbers of soldiers were teenagers barely beginning adulthood. Many had never left their hometowns before the war. The sudden shift from familiar routines to the intensity of military life changed them quickly. They learned discipline, experienced fear, and developed a sense of responsibility that came from depending on their fellow soldiers. Another striking reality is how little many soldiers understood about the broader issues of the war. While leaders debated principles and policies, the men in the ranks often had simpler motivations. Some fought to defend their homes. Others enlisted to earn money or escape hardship. Many believed they were protecting the future of their families. Only a portion fully understood the political and social forces behind the conflict. Their experiences reflected the everyday lives of Americans who found themselves pulled into a national struggle. Throughout the war, soldiers continued to adapt. They learned to read landscapes, identify artillery positions, and judge distances under pressure. They became skilled at building fortifications and constructing shelters. They carried heavy equipment during long marches, often through mud, heat, or freezing temperatures. Their endurance shaped the outcome of many campaigns. Armies relied not only on strategy, but on the strength and determination of the individuals who carried out the orders. Despite the heavy burden, moments of humanity emerged even between opposing sides. Soldiers occasionally met during temporary truces, exchanging tobacco, newspapers, or stories. These quiet encounters reminded them that the men they fought were also farmers, laborers, and young volunteers shaped by circumstances. Such moments did not erase the conflict, but they revealed how thin the line between enemy and neighbor could be in a divided nation. As the war continued, each soldier's journey became a blend of hardship, routine, fear, and endurance. They faced long marches, difficult weather, limited resources, and constant uncertainty. Many wrote about missing home, fields that needed tending, families waiting for news, and the simple comfort of familiar surroundings. Yet they remained committed to their regiments and to the brothers in arms they had come to trust. The story of the Civil War cannot be told without understanding these soldiers. They were the heart of the conflict, carrying the weight of decisions made far above them. They faced the realities of war on muddy roads, in crowded camps, and on smoky battlefields. Their letters, memories, and experiences offer a deeper understanding of what the war meant to the people who fought it. Part 5. Death Everywhere. When people think of the Civil War, they often imagine the roar of cannons, the crack of rifles, and the smoke drifting over battlefield fields. Yet, for the soldiers who lived through the conflict, the most constant threat did not come from bullets. It came quietly, invisibly, and without warning. Disease, simple, common illnesses that spread rapidly in crowded camps, killed more men than any battle. The war unfolded not only in open fields, but also in makeshift hospitals, muddy tents, and crowded encampments where sickness traveled unchecked. The scale of disease during the Civil War is difficult to fully grasp. Dysentery, typhoid fever, measles, malaria, pneumonia, and countless infections moved through the armies with alarming speed. Nearly 2 out of every 3 deaths came not from gunfire, but from illness. Soldiers could march bravely into combat and survive the fiercest fighting, only to face a sickness that struck quietly during the long nights that followed. The constant presence of disease shaped every aspect of military life, from the food they ate to the clothes they wore and the routines they followed. One reason illness spread so easily was the simple fact that most soldiers had never lived in such close quarters before. Many came from rural communities where families lived far from one another. They were unused to large gatherings of people. When thousands of men slept in rows of tents, shared water sources, used poorly placed latrines, and ate from the same cooking fires, sickness had ideal conditions to thrive. Even small errors in camp layout, placing latrines uphill from water barrels, or cooking areas too close to waste, could trigger outbreaks that lasted for weeks. Medical knowledge at the time was limited. Germ theory was not yet widely accepted in America, and many doctors believed illness came from bad air rather than microorganisms. They understood that cleanliness helped, but they did not fully comprehend why. As a result, Many camps lacked proper sanitation. Water often came from streams contaminated by animal waste or the runoff of multiple camps upstream. Soldiers washed clothes in the same water they drank. Cooking utensils were rarely cleaned thoroughly. Food spoiled quickly in the heat. Even simple practices that modern readers consider common sense, washing hands before eating, boiling water, separating waste areas from living areas, were not always followed. In the early months of the war, illness hit new recruits with particular force. Measles, a disease many had never been exposed to, spread rapidly. Entire regiments fell ill within days of arriving at camp. For some, the disease passed with discomfort. For others, complications such as pneumonia or infections became fatal. Letters from the time show how medical tents overflowed with coughing, feverish men who felt more frightened by sickness than by the prospect of battle. They wrote home, describing long nights spent listening to the labored breathing of friends lying beside them, unsure who would survive. Dysentery was perhaps the most feared disease of the war, though soldiers rarely spoke of it directly. Caused by contaminated food or water, it led to severe dehydration and weakness. It spread quickly in warm weather and struck repeatedly. Soldiers often called it the flux or the trots, avoiding more explicit descriptions. Its symptoms made travel difficult, lowered morale, and left men too weak to march. Entire companies sometimes moved slower because so many soldiers were suffering from stomach illnesses that left them exhausted and faint. In many cases, dysentery led to fatal complications, especially when untreated. Typhoid fever, spread by contaminated water, also ravaged the camps. High fevers, delirium, rashes, and internal bleeding made it one of the deadliest diseases of the war. Soldiers who contracted typhoid often needed weeks to recover, if they survived at all. Medical staff tried to help, but their tools were limited. Treatments focused on easing symptoms, not curing the underlying cause. Quinine was used for malaria. Chloroform and whiskey were used for pain. But for typhoid and dysentery, there were few reliable remedies. Rest, cleanliness, and fresh water were the best options available. Luxuries not easily found in an army on the move. One of the greatest challenges facing military doctors was the overwhelming number of patients. Medical staff were few, and many had limited experience with large-scale emergencies. Doctors worked long hours, often with minimal equipment. Surgeons were trained, but their knowledge was rooted in an era before modern sanitation. They reused tools on patient after patient, believing that wiping a blade clean was sufficient. Sawdust covered the floors of surgical tents, absorbing blood during amputations. Bandages were washed and reused when supplies ran short. Infections from minor wounds became life-threatening. Soldiers feared being taken to hospitals, not because of poor treatment, but because survival rates were so low. Hospital conditions varied depending on location and resources. Large cities such as Washington, Richmond, and Philadelphia eventually developed efficient hospital systems with wards, organized staff, and relatively clean conditions. These facilities could treat thousands of patients at a time. But in the field, medical care remained unpredictable. A hospital might be a church, a barn, a schoolhouse, or a row of tents arranged hurriedly after a battle. Injured men lay on straw pallets or bare floors. Windows offered ventilation, but also dust and insects. Doctors often worked through the night with lanterns flickering above them. Despite the difficulties, many surgeons displayed remarkable dedication. They operated under immense pressure, knowing that delays could cost lives. They made choices quickly, sometimes performing dozens of amputations in a single day. Amputations were common because shattered limbs from rifle fire often became infected rapidly. Removing the limb early increased a soldier's chance of survival. It was a brutal decision, but often the only one available. Chloroform or ether was typically administered before surgery, making the Civil War one of the first major conflicts where anesthesia was commonly used. This spared many soldiers from the pain that earlier generations had endured. The men who recovered from surgery faced long, difficult journeys. Infection was a constant threat. Medical staff cleaned wounds as best they could, but without an understanding of bacteria, many post-operative infections proved fatal. When soldiers did survive, they adjusted to life with missing limbs or long-term disabilities. The war created a generation of veterans who would live with these physical reminders for the rest of their lives. In the midst of these challenges, certain figures rose to prominence for their efforts to improve conditions. One such figure was Clara Barton, whose work on the battlefield and in hospitals laid the foundation for the American Red Cross. She traveled to the front lines, bringing supplies, comfort, and care to wounded soldiers. Her presence offered relief in environments that were otherwise dominated by pain and fear. Other women, both North and South, volunteered as nurses, relief workers, and suppliers. Their contributions, often overlooked in early histories, were essential to improving the survival rates of countless soldiers. Disease did not discriminate between Union and Confederate armies. Both sides struggled equally with outbreaks, shortages, and inadequate medical knowledge. Southern camps faced additional challenges because the Confederacy lacked industrial resources. Many soldiers fought with poor clothing, insufficient rations, and limited access to medicine. Blockades reduced the availability of imported goods, and substitute remedies became common. Soldiers brewed herbal teas, applied poultices, and relied on folk remedies passed down through generations. While some treatments offered relief, many did little to combat the underlying cause of illness. The psychological effects of disease also shaped the experience of the war. Soldiers grew accustomed to the constant presence of sickness. They watched friends fall ill suddenly and fade within days. They wrote home describing the stillness of hospital wards, where men spoke in whispers or remained silent with exhaustion. They described the eerie quiet after disease swept through a regiment, leaving empty spaces in the tents. These experiences created a somber awareness that death could come at any time, even without the sound of battle. For officers, disease posed practical challenges. Commanders needed healthy troops to fight, march, and hold positions. When disease spread, entire regiments weakened. Campaigns were delayed or altered because too many soldiers were unfit for duty. Armies often paused for weeks to recover from outbreaks, giving opposing forces time to reorganize. The course of the war shifted repeatedly because illness changed the balance of manpower. As the conflict progressed, soldiers learned how to adapt. They dug deeper latrines, chose camp locations more carefully, and cleaned their cooking tools more frequently. Some developed routines for boiling water or washing clothes. These small changes helped reduce the spread of sickness, though not enough to prevent it completely. Experience gradually taught officers the importance of sanitation, and by the later years of the war, some camps became healthier than those at the beginning. Even so, disease remained a constant companion. It traveled with the armies, settled in their tents, and waited in their water barrels. It shaped morale and forced soldiers to develop resilience that went beyond battlefield courage. Men who recovered from illness often returned to their units thinner, weaker, and more aware of their vulnerability. Yet they continued to serve, driven by loyalty, duty, or the simple determination to see the war through. The presence of death in camp life affected how soldiers viewed the world. They became familiar with the rituals of burial, simple ceremonies held behind tents or along the edges of makeshift hospitals. Chaplains offered prayers. Comrades said quiet farewells. Graves were marked with wooden boards carved with names when possible. In many cases, soldiers buried friends with care, promising to write to families when time allowed. These acts provided small moments of dignity amid the harsh reality of war. The emotional weight of constant illness and loss cannot be overstated. Soldiers carried memories of friends who died beside them, of nights spent listening to coughing or fevered whispers, and of mornings when they discovered empty spaces where someone had slept only hours earlier. These experiences deepened their understanding of sacrifice and shaped their commitment to the cause they served, whatever that cause might be. The Civil War is remembered for its battles, but the quieter struggles in the camps reveal a more complete picture of the conflict. Disease shaped strategies, weakened armies, and claimed lives in numbers far greater than bullets. It reminded soldiers and commanders alike that war brings suffering in many forms, not all of them loud or visible. Understanding this side of the war helps illuminate the human cost that often remains hidden behind battlefield statistics. It shows how much soldiers endured even when no battles were being fought, and how the long months between campaigns carried their own challenges and dangers. Part 6: Weapons, Iron, and the Age of Innovation. When the Civil War began, many Americans assumed the fighting would resemble the conflicts of earlier generations. Short engagements fought with familiar weapons and tactics. They imagined repeating the patterns their fathers and grandfathers had used in previous wars. Yet the world had changed quietly in the decades before 1861. New inventions, scientific discoveries, and industrial developments had begun transforming everyday life. When these innovations entered the battlefield, the war shifted into something far more modern than anyone was prepared to face. At the heart of this transformation stood a simple, powerful change in weaponry: the widespread use of the rifled musket. Earlier muskets fired round balls that traveled only short distances with limited accuracy. Soldiers using them relied on tight formations and mass volleys. The rifled musket, however, used spiraled grooves inside the barrel to spin the bullet, dramatically increasing range and precision. A soldier armed with this weapon could strike a target at distances once considered impossible. Combined with the newly invented Minié ball, a conical bullet that expanded when fired, the rifled musket became a devastating tool. What made this development so tragic was the fact that military tactics did not immediately evolve to match the new technology. Commanders on both sides continued using formations designed for smoothbore muskets. Tight rows of men advancing across open fields, shoulder to shoulder, moving slowly toward the enemy. These tactics, once effective, became deadly when met with the accuracy and range of the new rifles. Entire lines of soldiers could fall within minutes. Officers, who were expected to lead from the front, suffered some of the highest casualty rates. The battlefield, once a place of disciplined movement, became a landscape of confusion, smoke, and unimaginable loss. Another technology that reshaped the war was the rapid development of artillery. Cannons had long been important in warfare, but by the 1860s, new designs offered increased reliability and firepower. Rifled artillery fired shells with greater accuracy, while smoothbore cannons still delivered destructive rounds filled with shrapnel. Explosive shells and case shot created clouds of deadly fragments. Canister shot, essentially a tin can filled with small iron balls, turned cannons into massive shotguns capable of shredding infantry at close range. Few soldiers forgot the sound of artillery. Many described it as the most terrifying part of battle. As these new weapons appeared, commanders began relying on field entrenchments more often. Trenches, earthworks, and barricades offered protection against the improved firepower of rifles and artillery. Soldiers learned how to dig quickly under pressure, creating defensive positions that could withstand long engagements. These early earthworks foreshadowed the trench warfare that would dominate future conflicts. The Civil War became a proving ground for techniques that modern armies would later adopt on a far larger scale. Beyond weapons, the war ushered in innovations in transportation and communication. railroads became essential tools for moving troops, supplies, and equipment across vast distances. The speed and efficiency of the rail system allowed armies to react more quickly to changing conditions. A regiment could board a train in the morning and arrive hundreds of miles away by nightfall. Supplies that once took weeks to transport by horse-drawn wagons could now arrive in days. Control of rail lines became a strategic priority. Battles and campaigns often focused on protecting or capturing key junctions. Trains carried weapons, food, uniforms, and reinforcements, shaping the pace and direction of the war. Alongside the railroads came another powerful tool, the telegraph. For the first time in American history, military commanders could communicate across great distances almost instantly. Messages that once required couriers riding for hours or days now traveled through wires in moments. Leaders monitored troop movements, coordinated plans, and responded to events with unprecedented speed. The telegraph gave the Union a significant advantage because the North had a more extensive network and greater industrial capacity to maintain it. President Lincoln used the telegraph constantly, visiting the War Department's telegraph office nearly every day to stay informed. His decisions, often made in real time, reflected a new era of wartime leadership. One of the most dramatic technological developments of the war occurred at sea. For centuries, wooden ships had dominated naval warfare. The Civil War, however, introduced a new kind of vessel, the ironclad. These armored ships, covered in thick plates of iron, could resist cannon fire that would have shattered wooden hulls. Their arrival marked the beginning of modern naval warfare. The most famous encounter between ironclads occurred in March 1862, when the Confederate CSS Virginia and the Union USS Monitor faced each other at Hampton Roads. The Virginia had been built on the burned hull of the USS Merrimack, transforming a ruined ship into a formidable war machine. Its sloped iron sides made it nearly impervious to artillery. When it first entered battle, it destroyed 2 Union wooden ships with ease, sending shockwaves through naval leadership. The Union responded with the Monitor, a radical design featuring a rotating iron turret. When the two ironclads met, the battle resembled nothing the world had seen before. Cannonballs bounced off their armor. Smoke and steam filled the air. The two ships circled and traded blows for hours without delivering a decisive victory. Yet, in that moment, naval warfare changed forever. Wooden fleets suddenly seemed obsolete. Every major power in the world took notice, beginning a global race to build iron vessels. Innovation extended beyond ships and weapons. Hot air balloons, though limited in number and difficult to manage, became early tools of aerial reconnaissance. Observers floated above battlefields, sketching enemy positions and communicating with commanders below. These early balloon corps faced hazards from weather, wind, and enemy fire, but their contributions offered a glimpse into the future of aerial warfare. Photography also played an unexpected role. Though cameras could not capture moving battles, they documented the aftermath with stark detail. Photographers like Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner traveled to battlefields to record what war truly looked like. Their images, showing fallen soldiers, ruined towns, and the faces of tired troops, shocked civilians who had never seen war so directly. These photographs became powerful reminders of the conflict's cost, giving future generations a visual record of the Civil War's human toll. Communication within armies also evolved. Flags, bugles, and drums continued to serve important roles, signaling instructions in the midst of battle. Yet these older forms of communication now worked alongside newer methods created to address the complexity of modern warfare. Cipher systems were developed to protect telegraph messages. Couriers carried sealed orders. Signal Corps units trained to send messages using coded arrangements of flags and lights. Innovation even touched the everyday life of soldiers. New types of tents, uniforms, and equipment were introduced as needs changed. The development of mass-produced clothing and standardized gear allowed armies to equip soldiers more efficiently, especially in the Union. Improved boots, belts, canteens, and haversacks helped men endure long marches. In some cases, regiments received repeating rifles, such as the Spencer carbine, that allowed them to fire multiple rounds before reloading. These weapons offered a substantial advantage, though they were not widely distributed due to cost. Medical practices, though limited in understanding, also began to shift. Surgeons adopted new tools, techniques, and organizational systems. Ambulance corps were created to move the wounded more quickly from battlefields to hospitals. Though far from perfect, these efforts improved survival rates and introduced concepts that later generations would refine into modern emergency medicine. Despite all this innovation, technology alone did not determine the outcome of battles. Courage, discipline, leadership, and luck continued to shape events. Yet the new tools of war created conditions that older strategies could not fully address. Commanders sometimes struggled to adapt. They issued orders based on assumptions formed in earlier decades, only to discover that the battlefield had changed beneath their feet. Victories and defeats often depended on how quickly leaders recognized the new reality. The Civil War's technological advances also revealed the power of industry. The North, with its factories, railroads, and skilled labor force, maintained an advantage that widened as the war progressed. It could produce weapons, uniforms, locomotives, and ironclads at a pace the South could not match. The Confederacy, relying on limited resources and struggling under blockades, demonstrated ingenuity but faced constant shortages. Southern soldiers often repaired rifles with improvised tools, wore patched uniforms, and made do with limited ammunition. Their creativity allowed them to continue fighting, but the imbalance in industrial capacity became increasingly clear. As the war moved from one year to the next, soldiers on both sides became familiar with this modern environment. They navigated landscapes scarred by trenches, telegraph wires, and rail lines. They marched alongside artillery pieces built with precision. They saw ironclads patrolling rivers. They witnessed balloons rising over camps. They lived in a world that blended old traditions with new inventions, creating a conflict unlike anything their ancestors had known. The combination of innovation and tragedy gave the Civil War a unique place in history. It became both the last major war of the old era and the first war of the new. Soldiers fought with courage born in earlier generations, yet confronted weapons that pointed toward the future. The experience shaped how they understood warfare, leadership, and survival. Part 7. The Hidden War. While battles raged on open fields and artillery shook the ground, another part of the Civil War unfolded in places far removed from the noise. Behind the visible conflict existed a quieter struggle, one carried out by people whose names rarely reached the newspapers and whose actions rarely received public credit. These were the scouts who slipped into enemy territory, the informants who passed secret messages, the women who listened carefully in parlors and hospitals, and the enslaved people who risked everything to guide refugees or reveal hidden information. Their work rarely involved gunfire, but it shaped the direction of campaigns and saved lives in ways few soldiers ever realized. This hidden war began almost as soon as the conflict started. The Union and the Confederacy both understood that information could be as powerful as armies. A well-timed message, a map drawn from memory, or a single overheard conversation could change the outcome of an entire campaign. Each side needed eyes beyond the battlefield, and both turned to those who were willing, or able, to operate in the shadows. One of the most remarkable figures in this realm was Alan Pinkerton, a Scottish-born detective who became the head of Union intelligence early in the war. Pinkerton believed deeply in the importance of gathering reliable information. He organized networks of agents who traveled under assumed identities, taking notes about troop movements, supply routes, and local sentiment. Some of these agents posed as peddlers or merchants. Others passed as farmers, laborers, or simple travelers. Pinkerton himself sometimes disguised his appearance to blend into crowds. His methods were not perfect. He often overestimated Confederate numbers, but he helped establish a more organized approach to military intelligence than the United States had ever used before. Confederate intelligence networks responded in their own ways. Richmond became a hub of espionage, with secret meetings held in back rooms, boarding houses, and dimly lit parlors. Among the Confederacy's most successful operatives was Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a well-connected Washington socialite whose charm and influence allowed her to gather information directly from politicians, officers, and diplomats. Her circle included senators and military leaders who had no idea she was quietly passing messages south. She used her home as a meeting place, hiding notes in vases, baskets, and even the curls of young children. Her information helped Confederate forces prepare for the First Battle of Bull Run, contributing to their early victory. Women, in fact, played a vital role in the hidden war. Their contributions came from their unique position in society, often overlooked, underestimated, or assumed to be uninvolved in political matters. This allowed them to move through spaces where men might be questioned or watched. They carried coded letters in their clothing, smuggled medicine and weapons, and monitored troop movements from their windows. Some operated alone. Others belonged to organized networks that stretched across towns and states. Harriet Tubman, already famous for her work guiding enslaved people to freedom, became a key Union spy and scout. Her knowledge of Southern terrain and her ability to move quietly through dangerous areas made her invaluable. Working with Union officers, she gathered intelligence, mapped routes, and led operations that freed hundreds of enslaved people. Tubman even helped plan and guide the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, an operation that destroyed Confederate supply lines and liberated more than 700 enslaved people. She remains one of the only women in the war to lead an armed military expedition. Enslaved people throughout the South contributed to the hidden war in countless ways. Their proximity to Confederate households, farms, and camps gave them knowledge that soldiers and officers sometimes overlooked. They observed troop movements, overheard conversations, and noticed changes in supply shipments or defensive positions. Many passed this information to Union forces, either directly by escaping to Northern lines or indirectly through networks of supporters. Their actions challenged the Confederacy's assumption that enslaved labor was passive or uninvolved. In reality, many enslaved people used the war as an opportunity to resist, escape, or undermine the system that held them in bondage. The hidden war also relied heavily on the use of codes, ciphers, and secret writing. Both sides developed systems for protecting their messages. Some used simple substitution codes, replacing letters with symbols or other letters. Others used more complex ciphers written in grids or patterns that required a key to understand. Invisible ink, made from lemon juice or milk, allowed spies to hide information between the lines of ordinary letters. Once heated, the hidden writing appeared. These methods were not perfect. Intercepted letters sometimes revealed weaknesses, but they demonstrated how deeply secrecy entered the war's fabric. Signal Corps units developed additional communication methods. They used colored flags to send messages across distances, waving them in precise patterns that represented letters and numbers. These signals could be seen by friendly forces far away, allowing officers to coordinate movements or warn about enemy advances. Lanterns served a similar purpose at night, blinking messages through the darkness. Because these signals were visible to both sides, they required careful coding. A single misplaced gesture could confuse entire regiments. Scouts were another essential part of the hidden war. These individuals traveled ahead of armies, sometimes alone, sometimes in small teams. They studied terrain, searched for safe routes, monitored enemy picket lines, and identified potential ambushes. Many scouts came from local communities and knew the land intimately. Their familiarity with forests, rivers, and mountain passes gave their armies a significant advantage. They often traveled at night, moving quietly along back roads and hidden paths, gathering information that would influence the next day's decisions. Some scouts became legendary for their ability to slip behind enemy lines. One such person was Sam Davis, a young Confederate courier known for his speed and resourcefulness. He carried messages and intelligence between commanders, relying on disguises and his deep knowledge of the landscape. Though eventually captured and executed, his story became a symbol of the personal risks involved in the hidden war. Union scouts also included men with specialized knowledge. Many were frontiersmen who understood tracking, navigation, and wilderness survival. Others were former riverboat pilots or guides familiar with the Mississippi River and its tributaries. Their skills helped Union forces plan river campaigns, identify weak points in Confederate defenses, and avoid traps in unfamiliar areas. Espionage also took unexpected forms. Civilians living near battlefields often observed troop movements from their homes, barns, or fields. Some passed information to passing soldiers or flagged down patrols to share warnings. Others carried coded messages disguised as simple letters to relatives. Children, often overlooked by soldiers, sometimes became messengers, carrying notes hidden in toys, pouches, or even inside the seams of clothing. Because espionage relied on secrecy, detection carried severe consequences. Spies captured by either side risked imprisonment, harsh interrogation, or execution. Both armies treated espionage as a grave offense. Many individuals who served as spies accepted these risks knowingly. Their courage often came from deep personal conviction, belief in a cause, loyalty to a commanding officer, or the desire to protect their homes and communities. The hidden war extended into major cities as well. Washington, Richmond, Baltimore, New Orleans, and Memphis all held networks of informants. These cities bustled with soldiers, government officials, diplomats, and civilians, creating ideal conditions for intelligence work. Boarding houses became meeting places where information changed hands. Newspapers carried coded announcements disguised as ordinary advertisements. Telegraph offices, despite being monitored, occasionally served as channels for secret messages. Couriers moved through alleyways, markets, and docks, blending into the steady flow of people. In border states such as Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, espionage reached another level of complexity. Families were often divided in their loyalties. Communities contained both Union and Confederate sympathizers. The landscape became a patchwork of small villages, farms, and towns, where everyone watched everyone else. Informants passed messages through subtle gestures, hidden symbols, or quiet conversations. The uncertainty made trust difficult. Even long-standing friendships strained under the pressure of suspicion. Guerrilla fighters operated in these contested regions as well. Their actions were not always coordinated with official armies, but they influenced the war nonetheless. They disrupted supply lines, sabotaged railroads, ambushed patrols, and hid in forests or hills when pursued. Some were motivated by political loyalty. Others acted out of personal grievances or local disputes. Their presence contributed to an environment where information, true or false, became a valuable and dangerous commodity. In the Confederacy, a group known as the Secret Line operated routes for communication and transportation across the South and even into Canada. This network assisted Confederate agents traveling abroad, carried diplomatic correspondence, and supported attempts to gain foreign recognition. In the North, counterintelligence efforts attempted to disrupt these operations. sometimes infiltrating Confederate networks or intercepting couriers. Meanwhile, enslaved people continued to play a critical role in the hidden war. Their movements drew less attention from Confederate soldiers, allowing them to gather and pass information quietly. They listened to conversations in kitchens, stables, workshops, and fields. They watched officers come and go. Many risked their lives to travel at night, seeking Union lines to share intelligence. Some joined the United States colored troops later in the war, transforming their knowledge into military strategy. Their contributions challenged the Confederacy's assumption that enslaved populations were reliable, controlled, or politically neutral. Even as the war continued, many soldiers remained unaware of the scale of espionage surrounding them. They saw occasional couriers or heard rumors of spies, but rarely understood how deeply intelligence work shaped their campaigns. They focused on their own duties, unaware that a single captured letter or overheard conversation might determine whether their regiment marched into battle or changed direction at the last moment. The hidden war proved that conflict is not fought only with weapons. It is also fought with whispers, observations, and decisions made far from the battlefield. It revealed how ordinary people, many without formal military training, could influence the course of history through quiet acts of bravery. And it showed how deeply the Civil War reached into the everyday lives of Americans, shaping choices in parlors, kitchens, barns, and back roads. Part 8. Slavery collapses from within. As the Civil War moved from its early months into a long and uncertain struggle, both armies realized that the conflict was not simply a battle between two governments or two visions of the nation. It was also a battle over the future of millions of enslaved people whose labor had built the Southern economy, sustained its plantations, and shaped its culture. For generations, slavery had been presented as an unshakable foundation of Southern life, permanent, controlled, and deeply embedded. Yet as Union forces advanced and Confederate defenses faltered, it became clear that slavery contained a weakness few leaders had ever acknowledged. Enslaved people possessed their own agency, their own intelligence, and their own vision of freedom. As the war progressed, they used every opportunity to reshape their fate, turning plantation fields, kitchens, workshops, and even battlefields into spaces of quiet but powerful resistance. From the very beginning of the war, enslaved people watched the movements of armies with careful attention. They listened to rumors, observed troop activities, and studied maps or newspapers left behind by owners and visitors. Many sensed that the conflict might finally weaken the system that had controlled their lives for so long. In letters, diaries, and second-hand accounts, enslaved people described the feeling of an approaching shift, a sense that the old order was beginning to tremble. Even without formal announcements, they recognized the significance of Union victories and Confederate retreats. Word spread quickly through plantations, traveling in whispered conversations, songs, coded messages, or quiet exchanges after sunset. Their first major opportunity to change the course of slavery came in 1861, when three enslaved men, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory, escaped from a Confederate work gang and fled to Fort Monroe, a Union stronghold in Virginia. When Confederate officers demanded their return, Union General Benjamin Butler refused, reasoning that if the Confederacy considered enslaved people property, then the Union could claim that property as contraband of war. This decision, made in a moment of improvisation, changed everything. It transformed Union camps into magnets for those seeking freedom. Thousands of enslaved men, women, and children soon followed, walking for miles through forests, swamps, and fields. Some arrived barefoot, others carried children on their backs. Many traveled under cover of night, guided only by memory, instinct, or faint landmarks. Their courage reshaped the war. As their movement toward Union lines grew so large, it became known as the Great Flight. These individuals did far more than seek safety. Once inside Union territory, they shared vital information about Confederate defenses, road conditions, supply storage, and troop movements. They identified weak points in fortifications. They described bridges, hidden paths, and terrain challenges that only local residents fully understood. Officers who initially viewed them with hesitation soon realized that these refugees held precious knowledge. Reports from the time show how commanders quickly began relying on their intelligence before planning marches or assaults. Confederate leaders recognized the danger but underestimated its scale. Many believed enslaved people were loyal or passive. They assumed long years of oppression had stripped away ambition and resistance. They convinced themselves that enslaved workers would remain obedient even while armies marched beyond the horizon. But as the war lengthened and Union forces drew closer, the truth became impossible to ignore. Plantations lost labor. Farms struggled to harvest crops. Families grew anxious as the people they claimed as property seized their own freedom. Slavery, once thought immovable, began to disintegrate from within. The courage of the enslaved was not limited to escape. Many chose to resist quietly while still in Confederate territory. They slowed their work, pretending to misunderstand instructions. They hid tools, damaged machinery, or misdirected patrols searching for supplies. They provided shelter to those escaping or shared food with refugees heading north. Some cared for families left behind by relatives who had joined Union camps. These acts, though subtle, weakened the Confederacy's supply system and morale. Union officers soon faced a practical question. What should they do with the thousands of people arriving in their camps? Early answers varied widely. Some commanders welcomed them with compassion, offering food, shelter, and opportunities to work. Others viewed them with suspicion or uncertainty, unsure how to integrate them into military structures. But the movement continued, and Union policy slowly adapted. Camps for refugees, often called contraband camps, formed near military bases. Conditions in these camps ranged from supportive to harsh, depending on location and leadership. Some camps built schools where formerly enslaved children learned to read for the first time. Others suffered from overcrowding, disease, and lack of supplies. Even so, the people who lived there recognized that they were experiencing a freedom their ancestors never had. In 1862, as the war intensified, President Lincoln faced growing pressure to address slavery directly. Union generals presented him with reports showing that the Confederacy relied heavily on enslaved labor for fortifications, farming, and manufacturing. Abolitionists urged immediate action. Military leaders asked for clarity, believing that a firm policy on emancipation would strengthen the Union's position. Lincoln studied these pressures carefully. His primary goal remained preserving the Union, but he began to understand that slavery lay at the heart of the conflict. The war could not be won without addressing it. Lincoln's eventual decision resulted in the Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 2 stages. An initial announcement in September 1862 and a final declaration on January 1, 1863. The proclamation declared enslaved people in Confederate-controlled territory to be free. It did not apply to border states or regions already under Union control, but its symbolic power was immense. It signaled to enslaved people that the federal government now recognized their right to freedom. It also allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, transforming the war from a struggle to preserve the Union into a fight for liberation. News of the proclamation traveled unevenly. Some learned of it within days. Others heard only months later. But whenever the news arrived, it ignited hope. Men who had once worked under threat of punishment now walked boldly toward Union lines. Families made desperate attempts to reunite. Slave patrols grew more aggressive, trying to stop the steady flow of people seeking freedom. Some plantations, especially in remote areas, resisted the news and continued operating as before. Despite resistance, the proclamation reshaped the war's moral center. The Union no longer fought solely to restore the nation. It fought to transform it. One of the most profound results of emancipation was the creation of the United States Colored Troops, USCT. Black men volunteered in such large numbers that the Union established special regiments led primarily by white officers. By the end of the war, around 180,000 black soldiers had served, roughly 1/10 of the entire Union Army. Many had been enslaved only months earlier. They entered the ranks with determination, discipline, and a deep understanding of what they were fighting for. Their service changed perceptions within the army. Officers who initially questioned their ability soon recognized their courage. Black soldiers defended fortifications, charged enemy lines, and fought in some of the war's fiercest battles. They faced greater risks than white soldiers, as Confederate policy often refused to treat captured black troops as prisoners of war. Despite these dangers, they continued to enlist and serve with distinction. Their presence on the battlefield symbolized a profound transformation in American society. As the war progressed, enslaved women also reshaped the conflict in powerful ways. Many escaped to Union lines alongside their families. Others supported Union troops by cooking, laundering, nursing the wounded, or sharing information about local geography. Women who remained on plantations resisted in subtler ways, teaching their children to read, protecting family members, or hiding important belongings. Their contributions, though less recorded, formed an essential part of the movement that weakened slavery from within. The collapse of slavery during the war created shockwaves throughout the Confederacy. Plantation owners, who once controlled large estates, found themselves with shrinking labor forces. Fields remained unplanted. Harvests were delayed. Wealth measured in human beings disappeared as enslaved men and women took back their freedom. Southern newspapers lamented the loss of control. Confederate officials debated policies to address labor shortages. Some proposed arming enslaved men in exchange for freedom, a suggestion that revealed both desperation and contradiction. The proposal arrived too late, and most Confederate leaders rejected it. As Union armies pushed deeper into Southern territory, they encountered plantations where enslaved people had already taken steps toward freedom. Some plantations stood nearly empty. Others operated in reduced form. A few attempted to continue under military occupation, with formerly enslaved people working for wages rather than under force. These early experiments in free labor offered glimpses of a future that would become central to Reconstruction. Freedom, however, did not arrive gently. Many who escaped faced hunger, sickness, separation, and uncertainty. Families were torn apart by distance or danger. Refugees searching for Union lines risked patrols, dogs, and hostile civilians. Even within contraband camps, conditions could be harsh. Yet despite these hardships, the movement toward freedom did not slow. It grew stronger with each passing month, driven by a faith that even the war's suffering could not extinguish. By the end of the war, slavery had unraveled far beyond what any political declaration could achieve on its own. Enslaved people themselves had dismantled the foundation of the system through their actions, by fleeing, resisting, informing, and ultimately fighting. Their courage redefined the war and forced the Union and Confederacy alike to confront a reality neither had fully anticipated. The collapse of slavery from within stands as one of the most powerful stories of the Civil War. It reveals not only the fragility of an oppressive system, but also the strength, intelligence, and determination of the people who lived under it. Their actions transformed the conflict from a political dispute into a moral struggle and reshaped the future of the United States. Part 9. The Turning Tides. By the middle years of the Civil War, both armies had endured enough hardship, loss, and uncertainty to understand that the conflict would not end quickly. Early hopes of swift victory faded as the seasons passed, replaced by the heavy knowledge that the war had become a test of endurance. The Union and Confederacy still believed deeply in their causes, but the balance between them was shifting. Small signs appeared, some almost invisible at first, that hinted the tide was beginning to turn. These signs emerged from battlefields, supply lines, politics, and the spirit of the people involved. Together, they formed a pattern that would eventually reshape the outcome of the war. One of the first major turning points came in the summer of 1863, when two significant events occurred almost simultaneously: the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and the fall of Vicksburg in Mississippi. These victories, one in the east and one in the west, marked the beginning of a slow but decisive shift in momentum. The story of Gettysburg began quietly, with soldiers searching for supplies rather than a grand battlefield. In late June, Confederate troops entered the small town, hoping to find shoes. Many Confederate soldiers marched barefoot or with worn-out boots, and the rumor that Gettysburg held a supply warehouse drew scouts into the area. What started as a routine search quickly escalated when Union cavalry encountered them. Within hours, both armies moved toward the town, drawn almost accidentally into what would become one of the most significant battles of the war. The landscape around Gettysburg shaped the coming conflict. Rolling hills, stone fences, wheat fields, and ridges created natural positions that each side tried to secure. On the first day, Confederate forces pushed Union troops through the town to higher ground south of Gettysburg. The Union's decision to hold those ridges, Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge, proved crucial. These positions offered a defensive advantage that would anchor the rest of the battle. The second day brought fierce fighting across places that would become etched into American memory. Little Round Top, a rocky hill on the Union left flank, became the site of one of the war's most famous defenses. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his regiment, the 20th Maine, held the position against repeated Confederate assaults. When their ammunition nearly ran out, Chamberlain ordered a bayonet charge down the hill, a desperate and unexpected maneuver that caught the Confederates off guard. It saved the flank and prevented the entire Union line from collapsing. Chamberlain later admitted he acted partly on instinct, knowing the position must not fall. The third day at Gettysburg brought the dramatic event remembered as Pickett's Charge. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, hoping to break the Union center, ordered an assault across open fields. Nearly 12,000 Confederate soldiers advanced in formation, stepping through smoke and cannon fire as Union artillery and rifles opened on them. The sight impressed even the Union soldiers defending the ridge, who later wrote that the bravery of their opponents was unforgettable. But courage alone could not overcome the defensive advantage of the Union line. The attack failed, leaving thousands wounded or killed on the field. When the battle ended, the toll was staggering. More than 50,000 casualties occurred in just 3 days. The scale of suffering shocked both armies. Lee's forces retreated toward Virginia, their momentum slowed. The Union Army, though exhausted, had held its ground. Gettysburg did not end the war, but it marked the first major moment when the Confederacy lost the initiative in the Eastern Theater. While Gettysburg unfolded, another drama was playing out far to the west. The city of Vicksburg, located on high bluffs along the Mississippi River, had become a key target for the Union. Control of the Mississippi would split the Confederacy and give the Union a powerful supply route. Confederate forces understood the city's importance and defended it fiercely. The Union Army, under General Ulysses S. Grant, spent months attempting to capture Vicksburg, trying canals, assaults, and diversions. Grant eventually crossed the Mississippi south of the city and moved inland, isolating Vicksburg from reinforcements. He won a series of battles in quick succession, pushing Confederate troops back into the city's defenses. Then came the siege. For over 40 days, Union artillery shelled the city while Grant's forces encircled it. Civilians dug caves into the hillsides, living underground to escape bombardment. Food shortages grew severe. Soldiers ate whatever they could find: mules, rats, or scraps of grain. Letters from the city described hunger, fear, and exhaustion that weighed more heavily with each passing day. On July 4, 1863, the day after Pickett's charge, Vicksburg surrendered. The coincidence of these two events was striking. The Union now controlled the Mississippi River from end to end, dividing the Confederacy. The victories lifted Union morale and signaled to the world that the Confederacy faced serious challenges. From these major turning points, the war began shifting in ways that affected both armies deeply. The Confederacy still fought with determination, but its resources stretched thin, supplies dwindled. Clothing, boots, weapons, and ammunition became harder to replace. Inflation soared, making basic goods unaffordable for many Southern families. Soldiers wrote home asking for clothing or food their families could not spare. The burden of war fell heavily on civilians, who endured shortages and uncertainty. Even the most loyal supporters of the Confederacy found themselves questioning the long-term outcome. In contrast, the Union benefited from its industrial strength. Northern factories produced rifles, artillery, uniforms, boots, and rail supplies faster than before. The telegraph network improved communication. Railroads transported troops more efficiently. Immigrant labor and growing populations kept the Union Army replenished. Though the North faced its own challenges, political disagreements, draft riots, and battlefield losses, it had the ability to sustain the war on a scale the South could not match. As the tide shifted, both armies fought with increasing desperation, adapting to new realities. Union commanders developed more aggressive strategies, while Confederate officers attempted to hold ground and find opportunities to strike quickly. In the East, Lee continued to maneuver skillfully, achieving localized victories even after Gettysburg. In the West, Union campaigns pushed deeper into Southern territory, capturing forts, towns, and rail lines. The turning tide of the war was not shaped only by battles or strategy. It was also shaped by the growing impact of emancipation. By 1863 and 1864, black soldiers served in Union regiments across the country. Their presence strengthened the Army and weakened the Confederacy's labor force. Their knowledge of the Southern landscape, combined with their determination to fight for freedom, gave the Union tactical advantages. Their courage in battles, such as the assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina, inspired admiration among many white soldiers who had once doubted their abilities. Another turning point came in 1864, when Lincoln faced re-election. Many Americans were tired of the war. Casualties were high. Families grieved. Some politicians demanded negotiations with the Confederacy to end the conflict. If Lincoln lost the election, the Union's commitment to total victory might have collapsed. But in September 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta, a victory that changed the political atmosphere dramatically. Newspapers across the North celebrated the event. Public confidence surged. Lincoln won re-election, reaffirming the nation's resolve to continue the war until the Confederacy surrendered. As 1864 progressed, the turning tide became even more visible. Sherman's march across Georgia destroyed railways, factories, and supplies vital to the Confederate war effort. Grant, now leading all Union armies, pressed Lee in Virginia with relentless determination. Battles such as the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor were brutal, costly, and often indecisive in the moment. Yet each confrontation pushed the Confederacy closer to exhaustion. Grant understood that the Union could replace its losses, the Confederacy could not. By early 1865, Confederate defenses weakened across multiple fronts. Food shortages grew severe. Desertions increased as soldiers sought to return to families struggling to survive. Government officials debated strategies, but the options narrowed. Slavery had already begun collapsing. Foreign recognition was never achieved. The Confederate treasury could not support prolonged resistance. The turning tides that began at Gettysburg and Vicksburg had become a powerful current the Confederacy could no longer resist. Despite these challenges, Confederate soldiers continued to fight with loyalty and courage. Many believed surrender would bring hardships they could not predict. Others felt bound by duty or honor. Their determination prolonged the war but could not reverse its direction. The Union, strengthened by industrial might, manpower, and political resolve, pressed forward with increasing confidence. The final months of the war unfolded with a quiet sense of inevitability. The Confederacy still hoped for a breakthrough, but each attempt failed. Union armies moved steadily, capturing cities, railroads, and supply centers. The Mississippi, the Shenandoah Valley, Tennessee, and Georgia came firmly under Union control. Richmond, the Confederate capital, felt increasing pressure as Grant closed in. The slow shift that began in 1863 had become a complete change in direction by 1865. The Confederacy had reached the limit of its strength. The Union, though weary, still possessed the resources and determination needed to continue. The turning tides had done their work. Part 10. Life behind the lines. While soldiers marched across miles of muddy roads and faced the danger of open battle, another world existed far from the noise of cannons and rifles. This world belonged to the civilians, families, farmers, merchants, enslaved people, factory workers, teachers, and children who lived behind the lines. Their experience of the Civil War was quieter, but in many ways just as difficult. They carried burdens that rarely reached official reports. They endured fear, uncertainty, hunger, loss, and the slow reshaping of daily life as the war pressed against their front doors. The home front in the North and the South looked very different, shaped by resources, geography, and the direction of the war. Yet people in both regions felt the conflict in deeply personal ways. For many, the war arrived not with guns, but with letters, rumors, shortages, and the steady disappearance of familiar routines. Life behind the Confederate lines changed dramatically in the early years of the conflict. Southern families quickly realized that war brought more than patriotic speeches and parades. The Union blockade, designed to isolate the Confederacy from international trade, tightened gradually. Imported goods grew scarce. Items once taken for granted, coffee, sugar, salt, shoes, cloth, medicines, became difficult to find or painfully expensive. Markets emptied. Store shelves reduced to essentials. Housewives improvised, creating substitutes from whatever materials were available. They brewed hot drinks from roasted acorns or chicory. They mixed ashes with water to make soap. They patched clothing repeatedly, turning scraps into dresses, shirts, or quilts. Inflation made every hardship worse. As the Confederate government printed more money to fund the war, prices rose rapidly. A sack of flour that once cost a few dollars might cost $100 a year later. Salt, essential for preserving meat, became so valuable that some families guarded it carefully or bartered it for other necessities. Newspapers described families skipping meals or stretching food supplies to feed children first. In some cities, shortages sparked anger that erupted into public demonstrations. One of the most dramatic occurred in Richmond in April 1863, when a large group of hungry women, armed with baskets, knives, and determination, marched through the streets demanding lower prices. The protest grew into what became known as the Bread Riot. It ended only after officials and soldiers intervened, offering limited aid and urging the crowd to disperse. Rural families faced different challenges. Many men had joined the Confederate Army, leaving farms without enough labor to plant or harvest crops. Women, children, and elderly relatives stepped into roles that demanded long hours of physical work. They planted fields, repaired fences, cared for livestock, and managed household responsibilities. Some families survived through cooperation with neighbors. Others developed new methods for farming with limited equipment. Their resilience kept communities functioning, even as war approached from the edges of the countryside. Fear became a constant companion. Union armies pushed deeper into Confederate territory with each passing year. Families living near rivers, railroads, or major roads knew that soldiers, Union or Confederate, might appear at any moment. These encounters varied widely. Some troops passed peacefully, asking for directions or supplies. Others demanded food or seized livestock. Homeowners hid valuables in wells, gardens, attics, or under floorboards. Children learned to recognize the distant sound of marching columns or approaching cavalry. Entire families gathered on porches or behind shutters, watching silently as dusty troops moved past. In Union territory, the experience behind the lines also changed steadily, though in different ways. Northern factories expanded rapidly to meet wartime demands. Cities such as Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Boston, and New York produced rifles, ammunition, boots, uniforms, and railway equipment. The constant movement of goods created a sense of energy and urgency. Smoke from factory chimneys thickened the air. Workers, men, women, and children, labored long hours to support the war effort. For many families, the conflict brought steady wages, though the work was demanding and sometimes dangerous. Women in both the North and South found themselves taking on new roles. Some worked in textile mills, producing cloth for uniforms. Others stitched clothing, rolled bandages, or prepared packages for soldiers. Many volunteered with relief organizations, sewing shirts, knitting socks, or collecting food for hospitals and camps. Churches organized gatherings where women stuffed pillows or wrote letters to soldiers they had never met. In the North, large organizations such as the United States Sanitary Commission coordinated donations, inspected camps, and improved medical care. Volunteers traveled across states to assist in field hospitals, bringing comfort to wounded men and helping prevent disease. Behind the lines, communication became both a lifeline and a source of anxiety. Families depended on letters from soldiers to understand how they were faring. A single envelope could ease months of worry or deepen it. Soldiers wrote whenever they could, describing camp life, weather, marching conditions, or simple memories from home. Their letters rarely mentioned the worst realities of battle. Many avoided frightening details to spare their loved ones. When letters arrived sporadically, families feared the worst. Newspapers printed casualty lists, prompting anxious parents, spouses, and siblings to scan columns for familiar names. Children experienced the war in their own way. Many grew up faster than they expected, learning responsibilities that earlier generations associated with adulthood. Boys worked in fields, mills, shops, or factories to replace fathers or older brothers at war. Girls helped with younger siblings, managed household chores, or assisted in sewing circles. Schools continued where possible, but attendance sometimes dropped as children contributed to family survival. Despite these hardships, moments of childhood persisted. Games played in yards, stories shared by firelight, and friendships formed during difficult times. The psychological impact of the war on civilians was profound. People lived with constant uncertainty. They feared receiving news of a death. They worried about the next harvest or the next round of shortages. They listened to distant gunfire or the steady rumble of troop movements. Even in quiet towns far from the front lines, the atmosphere carried a heaviness that reflected the country's fractured state. Civilians also endured the presence of military occupation. In some regions, Union troops controlled entire towns for months or years. Their presence brought a mixture of order, tension, and cultural clash. Some Northern soldiers attempted to treat local civilians with respect, offering payment for supplies or assisting with community needs. Others behaved with suspicion, believing all Southerners were hostile. Civilians adapted to new rules, curfews, patrols, and regulations. Daily life required careful navigation, especially for those whose loyalties differed from those in power. In border states, life behind the lines was particularly complicated. Communities were divided between Union and Confederate sympathies. Neighbors distrusted one another. Guerrilla fighters moved through forests and hills, launching quick attacks before disappearing again. Civilians faced pressure from both sides, each demanding loyalty, supplies, or information. Many families suffered losses regardless of their allegiance, as raids, reprisals, and shifting control disrupted daily life. African Americans in Union-held areas experienced profound transitions. Those who escaped slavery sought work, education, and security. Some lived in contraband camps, which varied significantly in quality. Better organized camps offered schools run by missionaries or volunteers. Children who had once been forbidden to read now practiced letters in makeshift classrooms. Adults attended evening lessons or learned trades. Other camps, however, suffered from overcrowding, disease, or insufficient supplies. Despite these challenges, the opportunity for freedom gave these communities a sense of purpose and possibility. White Southerners faced increasing hardship as the war progressed. Letters from Confederate soldiers described families struggling with hunger, debt, or isolation. Women wrote to husbands requesting advice about managing farms or negotiating with officials. Newspapers carried stories of communities coming together to support soldiers' families, sharing resources or offering protection. Churches organized food drives and prayer meetings. These efforts reflected a desire for resilience in the face of uncertainty. In the North, morale rose and fell with battlefield news. Victories brought celebrations. Defeats sparked frustration or protest. Draft laws introduced new tensions, especially among working-class communities. In New York City in 1863, anger over the draft, combined with racial and economic tensions, erupted into deadly riots. Buildings burned. Violence swept across neighborhoods. The city required federal troops to restore order. The event left deep scars and revealed how fragile unity could be, even in regions not directly threatened by invasion. Throughout the war, civilians continued shaping the conflict in ways often overlooked. They produced supplies, raised funds, organized relief efforts, and supported soldiers mentally and emotionally. Their sacrifices sustained armies and influenced public opinion. Their resilience allowed communities to survive despite tremendous strain. Behind the lines, the war revealed not just the fragility of daily life, but also the strength found in cooperation and adaptability. Families learned to grow new crops, mend old clothes, share scarce resources, and care for those in need. They formed bonds that carried them through the most difficult seasons. They also learned to live with absence, the absence of loved ones, of security, of normal routines. This absence marked an entire generation. As the war neared its later stages, civilians noticed changes in the atmosphere. Union victories increased. Confederate defenses weakened. Rumors spread more quickly. Soldiers began returning home, wounded or exhausted. Enslaved communities across the South continued taking bold steps toward freedom. The sound of war moved closer to some towns and further from others. Each shift added new layers of uncertainty or hope. The experience of life behind the lines reminds us that the Civil War was not fought only on battlefields. It was also fought in kitchens, farms, workshops, and town squares. It shaped children who grew into adults, marked by the memory of rationing, fear, and resilience. It reshaped families whose roles stretched beyond familiar boundaries. It affected the emotional landscape of millions who faced challenges silently, without recognition or applause. Their sacrifices, though less dramatic than the battles at Gettysburg or Vicksburg, were essential to the war's outcome. They kept armies supplied, helped communities survive, and held families together through years of uncertainty. Part 11. The Prison Camps. Long before the war reached its final years, soldiers on both sides understood that the battlefield was not the only place where danger waited. Behind the lines, far from the sound of cannons, prison camps emerged as one of the war's harshest realities. These places were often not built to punish, but they quickly became symbols of the conflict's deepest suffering. Captured soldiers found themselves living in crowded spaces, battling hunger, disease, and despair. The war inside these camps unfolded quietly, away from newspapers and generals, yet the experience shaped the lives of tens of thousands of men. For soldiers, capture came suddenly and rarely with warning. A broken line, an unexpected charge, or a confused retreat might leave a man surrounded. Some surrendered alone. Others laid down their weapons alongside dozens or hundreds of comrades. Once the fighting ended, guards gathered the prisoners and marched them toward holding areas. For many, this journey marked the beginning of a long ordeal. They walked for miles with little food, sometimes through hostile territory, where civilians shouted insults or threw objects. The uncertainty of captivity settled heavily on their minds. They wondered about their families, their regiments, and their future. The earliest months of the war saw relatively lenient treatment of prisoners. Both sides expected the conflict to end quickly, so captured soldiers were often exchanged through a system based on rank and number. Officers were sometimes paroled, allowed to go home if they promised not to fight until formally exchanged. Camps were temporary, cramped but manageable. Barges, warehouses, and old buildings served as holding spaces. Soldiers believed they would soon return to their units. But as the war progressed, the exchange system collapsed. Disagreements over the treatment of black Union soldiers created a stalemate. The Confederacy refused to treat black prisoners as equal to white soldiers, while the Union insisted on equal recognition for all its men. Exchanges halted. Captured soldiers no longer expected to return home quickly. Prison camps expanded with alarming speed. Neither government had fully prepared for the number of captives they now held. The result was overcrowding that overwhelmed even the best-intentioned commanders. Facilities designed for thousands suddenly held tens of thousands. Food supplies dwindled. Sanitation collapsed. Disease spread rapidly. Both sides faced these difficulties, though the Confederacy suffered more severely because of shrinking resources and blockaded ports. Andersonville, the most infamous Confederate prison camp, became the starkest symbol of these conditions. Officially known as Camp Sumter, it was built in rural Georgia and opened in early 1864. The camp covered roughly 26 acres and consisted of an enclosed stockade made of tall pine logs. The only water source was a small stream running through the center, polluted almost immediately by waste and washing. There were no barracks. Prisoners constructed crude shelters from blankets, sticks, and scraps of cloth. Some dug holes into the earth for protection from the sun and rain. At its peak, Andersonville held more than 30,000 Union soldiers. The overcrowding was severe. Men slept shoulder to shoulder. Those without shelter endured blistering heat, sudden storms, and bitter nights with no cover. Food shortages grew worse as Confederate resources declined. Meals consisted mostly of cornmeal and small amounts of beans or occasional scrap meat. Many prisoners developed scurvy due to lack of fresh vegetables. Limbs swelled. Gums bled. Skin split and refused to heal. Disease touched nearly every corner of the camp. Dysentery, typhoid fever, and infections swept through the population. The smell of sickness hung in the air, especially near the swamp area where the polluted stream widened. The ground there became soft and foul, filled with insects and human waste. Prisoners avoided it when possible, though overcrowding left few places untouched by illness. Despite the misery, the prisoners created their own internal systems. They formed small groups for mutual support. They organized ways to distribute water more fairly. They carved bowls, spoons, and tools from bits of wood. They built trading networks where men exchanged rations, clothing scraps, or handmade items. At night, they talked quietly about home, hoping for an exchange that never came. Within Andersonville existed a notorious group known as the Raiders, a band of prisoners who stole from weaker men. They seized blankets, food, utensils, and valuables in nighttime attacks. Eventually, the majority of prisoners formed a group called the Regulators to stop them. A court of prisoners held trials. Several raiders were punished harshly, and some were executed inside the camp. These events revealed the desperate struggle for survival that unfolded among men who had once fought on the same side. The suffering at Andersonville shocked even some Confederate officers. Captain Henry Wirtz, appointed to command the camp, faced immense challenges. Supplies were scarce, guards were limited. The Confederacy lacked lumber, medicine, and manpower. Wirtz made some efforts to improve conditions, but enforced strict rules with severity, creating fear and resentment. When the war ended, he was arrested, tried, and executed by the United States for war crimes. His case remained controversial for generations, reflecting the complexity of judging responsibility within a failing system. Union prison camps, though often better supplied, were far from free of suffering. Harsh winters, disease, and overcrowding plagued many facilities. Elmira Prison in New York, sometimes called Hellmira by inmates, became one of the deadliest northern camps. Located in a region known for freezing winters, the camp held Confederate soldiers in barracks that offered limited protection against the cold. Frostbite, pneumonia, and illness spread rapidly. Supplies were better than in southern camps, but mismanagement, contaminated water, and limited blankets made conditions severe. Nearly 3,000 men died there in less than a year. Another large Union prison, Camp Douglas in Chicago, struggled with swampy ground and outbreaks of disease. Newly captured soldiers often arrived already weakened from long marches or inadequate nutrition. Once inside, they faced harsh weather, poor sanitation, and occasional hostility from guards. Mortality rates varied across different camps, but the combination of cold, contaminated water and overcrowding left a deep mark on survivors' memories. Despite the hardship, prisoners, North and South, found ways to maintain a sense of humanity. Many built small libraries by trading books or sharing fragments of old newspapers. Others organized debates, discussions, or informal classes. Men taught each other mathematics, reading, languages, or practical skills. These activities created moments of normalcy in an otherwise grim environment. Some prison camps developed surprising cultural life. At Johnson's Island in Lake Erie, where Confederate officers were held, prisoners staged theatrical performances complete with costumes improvised from blankets and uniforms. They wrote newspapers handwritten on scraps of paper. Music drifted across the camp on quiet evenings as prisoners sang familiar songs or played homemade instruments. Baseball, still a relatively new sport at the time, gained popularity in several Union camps. Prisoners organized teams, carved bats from available wood, and played games to pass the long hours. These games helped distract men from hunger or homesickness. They also provided physical exercise and reminded soldiers of life before the war. Moments of compassion occasionally passed between guards and prisoners. Some guards, on both sides, shared extra food, blankets, or tobacco when possible. Others exchanged stories or letters, but these moments varied widely. At some camps, guards behaved harshly, enforcing rules with punishment or intimidation. At others, they treated prisoners with a mix of firmness and sympathy, recognizing that most captives were farm boys, clerks, or laborers far from home. Escapes, though difficult, occurred frequently. Prisoners tunneled beneath fences, disguised themselves as guards, or joined work crews sent outside camp walls. Not all escape attempts succeeded. Those who failed risked solitary confinement, reduced rations, or shackles. Yet the desire for freedom drove many to try, especially as the war stretched into its later years and hope seemed increasingly uncertain. Perhaps the most powerful emotion inside the camps was longing. Prisoners spoke often of home. They imagined meals with their families, working in familiar fields, or walking through hometown streets. Letters, when they arrived, lifted spirits. A single page from a wife, parent, or sibling could sustain a man for weeks. But letters did not always reach their destinations. Some were lost, some were intercepted, some were never written because families had moved or fallen on hard times. The silence weighed heavily. Even amid hunger and despair, bonds formed between prisoners. They shared rations, supported the sick, and helped one another survive. Those who lived through captivity often remembered the friends who kept them moving forward. Men who offered half a meal, who gave shelter during storms, or who told stories in the darkness to ease fear. As the war neared its final months, conditions in many camps worsened, supplies dwindled, command structures weakened. Guards themselves often went hungry, yet the approach of the war's end brought a spark of hope. Exchanges resumed in limited form. Some prisoners caught rumors that armies were retreating or surrendering. These whispers created a quiet, cautious sense that release might be near. When liberation finally arrived, the scenes were emotional. Many prisoners collapsed from relief as they passed through camp gates. Others walked unsteadily, weakened by months of illness. Union and Confederate prisoners alike returned home with bodies changed by captivity. Many carried memories that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Some suffered long-term health problems. Others faced nightmares or anxieties that lasted long after peace returned. The story of the prison camps offers a deeper understanding of the Civil War's human cost. These camps were not battlefields, yet the suffering inside them was often just as severe. They revealed the limitations of both governments, the harshness of wartime conditions, and the resilience of men who endured unimaginable hardships. Part 12. The Final Surge. By the final years of the war, the landscape of the conflict had changed so drastically that even seasoned soldiers struggled to recognize it. The excitement that had filled the early months, the parades, the patriotic songs, the speeches full of certainty, had faded into something quieter and heavier. Both armies carried the weight of loss. Cities bore scars from occupation. Families lived with exhausted hope. Yet despite all the suffering, the war continued to move forward, drawing the Union and the Confederacy toward a final, decisive surge. This stage of the conflict was defined by determination. Leaders on both sides knew the war could not continue indefinitely. The Confederacy fought to preserve a collapsing system. The Union pushed to restore a nation fractured beyond anything imagined in earlier decades. Every campaign began to feel like a test of endurance. Soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike sensed that the end was approaching, though none could say exactly when or how it would arrive. In the Eastern Theater, the Union placed its hopes on General Ulysses S. Grant. By 1864, Grant had gained a reputation for persistence and strategic vision. His victories in the West, at Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and numerous other battles, convinced President Lincoln that he was the right man to lead all Union armies. Grant accepted the responsibility with quiet resolve. He understood the scale of the task before him. The Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, remained formidable despite mounting struggles. Grant's strategy focused on constant pressure. He aimed to wear down Confederate forces through coordinated campaigns across multiple states, leaving Lee no time to rest or regroup. This approach led to one of the most brutal sequences of battles in American history. In May 1864, Grant pushed his forces into the dense forests of northern Virginia, beginning the Overland Campaign. The first battle erupted in a tangled region known as the Wilderness. Thick underbrush, narrow paths, and dry leaves made visibility poor and movement difficult. Muskets sparked fires that spread rapidly, trapping wounded soldiers who could not escape the flames. Smoke from burning trees mixed with fog and gunpowder, creating an eerie haze. Grant refused to retreat after the battle, even though losses were heavy. He continued advancing south, forcing Lee to fight again at Spotsylvania, where soldiers battled for days in muddy trenches and rain-soaked fields. The intensity of combat in the Overland Campaign revealed how the war had evolved. The columns of advancing soldiers, the long lines of earthworks, and the relentless artillery fire reflected the beginning stages of modern warfare. Soldiers dug trenches that stretched for miles. Mud, smoke, and exhaustion became constant companions. The famous struggle at the Bloody Angle in Spotsylvania saw hand-to-hand fighting that lasted nearly 20 hours, with both sides locked in close combat amid a storm of rain and gunfire. Survivors later wrote that the sound of battle there was unlike anything they had heard before or after. After weeks of continuous fighting, both armies suffered heavy casualties. But Grant continued forward, crossing rivers and maneuvering south toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. By summer, the two armies reached Petersburg, where the conflict transformed into a long siege. Soldiers on each side dug trenches, built fortifications, and spent months facing one another across a sprawling network of earthworks. It was a slow, grinding struggle that tested patience as much as strength. Skirmishes erupted daily. Soldiers endured heat, cold, disease, and a growing sense of uncertainty. Yet every day of the siege weakened the Confederacy further. While Grant pressed Lee in Virginia, another Union general reshaped the war in the West. William Tecumseh Sherman, known for his sharp mind and uncompromising approach, launched a campaign through Georgia aimed at capturing Atlanta, a major rail center and symbol of Confederate strength. Sherman's movements through the South were methodical. He maneuvered his army around Confederate positions, forcing them to retreat repeatedly. Each step brought him closer to Atlanta, whose defenses stretched across ridges, fields, and industrial areas. The fight for Atlanta lasted through the summer of 1864. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston initially used a strategy of cautious retreat, hoping to stretch Sherman's supply lines. Frustrated by the slow pace, Confederate President Jefferson Davis replaced Johnston with General John Bell Hood, a more aggressive commander. Hood launched repeated attacks, attempting to break Sherman's lines. Despite moments of intense fighting, these assaults failed, and Confederate losses mounted steadily. In September 1864, Union forces entered Atlanta. The capture of the city stunned the Confederacy and transformed public opinion in the North. It boosted Lincoln's re-election campaign and signaled that the war might finally be moving toward resolution. After securing Atlanta, Sherman made a controversial decision. He cut his supply lines, divided his army, and marched towards the Atlantic coast on what became known as the March to the Sea. His goal was to break the South's ability to wage war. Sherman's men destroyed railroads, burned warehouses, and confiscated food and livestock. They passed through small towns, plantations, and farms. Some residents fled before the army arrived. Others watched in fear as soldiers dismantled the infrastructure that had supported the Confederate war effort. Though Sherman issued strict orders against harming civilians, his campaign left deep emotional scars. Many Southerners remembered it as a symbol of devastation. Union soldiers remembered it as a march that hastened the end of the war by striking at the heart of Confederate resources. Meanwhile, Union forces under General Philip Sheridan worked to secure the Shenandoah Valley, a region often described as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Confederate troops used the valley for supplies, movement, and communication. Sheridan's campaign pushed them out and destroyed crops, mills, railroads, and warehouses. These actions, though harsh, weakened the Confederacy's ability to sustain its armies. By late 1864, Union forces controlled large portions of the South, cutting off vital supply lines and reducing the Confederacy's territory. The Confederate Army, though still fighting with determination, faced growing struggles. Supplies ran dangerously low. Horses grew thin. Uniforms were patched repeatedly. Ammunition shortages became common. Letters from soldiers described hunger, exhaustion, and fear for families at home. Many wrote about their uncertainty, wondering whether they should remain with their regiments or return home to protect their loved ones. Desertions increased, though many soldiers stayed out of loyalty, pride, or a sense of duty that refused to bend, even in the face of defeat. Back in Richmond, the Confederate government struggled to maintain its structure. Inflation soared. Food was scarce. Civilians endured cold winters with limited fuel. Newspapers tried to project confidence, but the tone shifted as Union armies drew closer. Railroad traffic slowed. Hospitals overflowed. The Confederate Congress debated measures that reflected growing desperation, including proposals to arm enslaved men in exchange for freedom, ideas unthinkable in earlier years. By the time such policies were considered, the Confederacy's strength was already too far diminished. Through late 1864 and early 1865, Grant tightened his grip around Petersburg. The siege dragged on for 9 long months. Soldiers on both sides lived in mud and trenches, enduring cold rains, shortages, and daily skirmishes. Tunneling operations, artillery duels, and nighttime raids became routine. The static lines resembled future wars more than past conflicts. It was a fight of attrition, and the Union held the overwhelming advantage. Finally, in March 1865, Grant launched a coordinated offensive across multiple positions. Confederate forces, stretched thin, held as long as possible. But they could not withstand the pressure. On April 2nd, Union troops broke through the lines. Lee recognized the situation immediately. He ordered an evacuation of Richmond and Petersburg, hoping to unite with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. Fires broke out in Richmond as warehouses were emptied or burned to prevent Union capture. Civilians fled or hid as the city fell into chaos. Union troops entered Richmond on April 3rd, greeted by crowds of newly freed African Americans celebrating their liberation. The fall of the Confederate capital marked one of the war's most symbolic moments. Lincoln visited the city shortly afterward, walking through streets where, only days before, Confederate leaders had made their final decisions. Residents approached him cautiously, some in tears, others silent with disbelief. His presence reflected the profound transition taking place. Lee's army retreated westward, hoping to reach supplies near Appomattox. But Union forces pursued relentlessly. Exhaustion overtook the Confederate troops. Hungry, outnumbered, and surrounded, many could no longer continue. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant in a humble home in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. The meeting was quiet and respectful. Grant offered generous terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home with their horses and personal belongings. He insisted there would be no humiliation. Lee accepted. With that meeting, the final surge of the war came to an end. The conflict was not completely over. Other Confederate forces surrendered in the weeks that followed, but the heart of the Confederacy had been cut away. The closing months of the Civil War revealed not only military strategy, but also the immense emotional toll carried by soldiers and civilians. They endured hunger, fear, uncertainty, and destruction. They saw landscapes transformed by trenches, scorched fields, and ruined towns. Yet they also witnessed moments of compassion, resilience, and hope, signs that a nation fractured by war might someday heal. Part 13. Surrender at Appomattox. By early April 1865, the Confederacy existed more in hope than in fact. Its armies were scattered, its cities strained beyond endurance, and its people exhausted from years of scarcity. Richmond had fallen. Petersburg could no longer hold. The long siege had broken, and the Army of Northern Virginia, once the most formidable Confederate force, retreated across the countryside, hungry, thin, and worn from months of unbroken pressure. The last chapter of the war had begun. General Robert E. Lee, guiding his diminishing army westward, hoped for one final chance. He aimed to reach supply trains near the town of Appomattox Station and then continue southward to link with General Joseph E. Johnston's forces in North Carolina. If the two armies could unite, there remained a slim possibility of prolonging the conflict. But even that hope rested on fragile ground. The Union Army, under General Ulysses S. Grant, pressed closely behind, moving with precision and determination. Grant understood the importance of ending the war as quickly and compassionately as possible. His pursuit was steady but restrained, reflecting his belief that needless bloodshed no longer served any purpose. The Confederate retreat was marked by hunger and exhaustion. Soldiers marched in tattered uniforms, many without shoes. Horses stumbled from weeks of hard use. The countryside, scarred by war, offered little assistance. Civilians along the roads watched quietly as Lee's men passed, some with sympathy, others with sorrow or disbelief. These soldiers, once symbols of Southern confidence, now bore the weight of collapse in every step. By April 8th, Union cavalry under General Philip Sheridan reached Appomattox Station and captured several supply trains loaded with food, ammunition, and uniforms, items Lee's army desperately needed. Sheridan quickly positioned his forces to block the Confederate path. Infantry reinforcements followed, forming a crescent around Lee's troops. The Army of Northern Virginia was now nearly surrounded. That night, Lee met with his officers. Lantern light flickered across their tired faces as they discussed the grim reality. Their men were starving. Ammunition was low. Marching further risked chaos. Fighting would lead to slaughter. Surrender, once unthinkable, now stood as the only option that might preserve the dignity and lives of the soldiers who had followed Lee through years of hardship. Lee, a man known for composure, even in the bleakest moments, wrote to Grant requesting a meeting to discuss terms. Grant received the message the next morning, April 9th. He was suffering from a severe headache, a lingering result of weeks of stress and restless nights. When he opened Lee's letter, he later recalled that his headache vanished instantly. He understood the significance of the moment, not just for the armies but for the nation. He mounted his horse and began riding toward Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee had indicated he would meet. The village of Appomattox Courthouse was small, little more than a cluster of homes, a tavern, a law office, and a courthouse at its center. Locals watched as soldiers from both sides gathered quietly outside town, maintaining a respectful distance as history approached. The meeting took place in the parlor of the McLean house, owned by Wilmer McLean, a man whose life had traced the arc of the war in an uncanny way. The First Battle of Bull Run had begun near his old home in 1861. Hoping to escape the conflict, he moved his family to Appomattox, only for the war to return to his doorstep 4 years later. Inside the house, the atmosphere was quiet and solemn. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains. A small table sat near the center of the room. Lee arrived first, wearing a new grey uniform with polished boots and his ceremonial sword, one of the last reminders of the dignity he maintained even in defeat. He appeared calm but fatigued, carrying the weight of years of leadership and the knowledge that countless lives depended on the decisions he would make that day. Grant entered shortly after. His appearance contrasted sharply with Lee's. He wore a simple, mud-stained private's coat, with only the shoulder straps indicating his rank. His boots were scuffed from weeks of marching. His manner was modest, almost informal. The two men, so different in style, yet united by experience, greeted each other with mutual respect. They had not met before, but each understood the other's place in history. What followed was one of the most important conversations in American memory, quiet, deliberate, and marked by humanity. At first, Grant spoke casually, recalling a brief earlier encounter during the Mexican-American War. He seemed momentarily unsure how to begin the official discussion, perhaps wanting to ease the tension in the room. Lee listened politely, though he gently steered the conversation toward the matter at hand. They both understood the gravity of the moment. When formal negotiations began, Grant's terms were generous. He asked only that Confederate soldiers lay down their arms and agree not to take them up again. Officers could keep their sidearms, personal horses, and belongings. Enlisted men who owned horses or mules could take them home for planting season, an important gesture, as those animals would help them rebuild their farms and survive the coming months. Grant requested no trials, no humiliation, and no retribution. His goal was to end the war, not punish those who had fought. Lee read the terms silently, then lifted his head with a quiet sense of relief. He accepted immediately. The two men signed the agreement, using simple writing desks placed in the parlor. The signing was not dramatic or ceremonial. It was quiet, steady, and direct. Two leaders doing what they believed was necessary for the future of the fractured nation. After signing, Lee asked Grant if Confederate soldiers could keep their horses, even if not officially listed as private property. Grant agreed. He understood the importance of allowing men to return home with the tools they needed to rebuild. Lee thanked him sincerely, noting that the gesture would mean much to the men under his command. When the meeting ended, the two generals shook hands. Lee stepped outside, mounted his horse, and rode slowly back through the Confederate lines. Soldiers removed their hats as he passed, many with tears in their eyes. They had followed him for years, through victories and defeats, across miles of countryside. Now they watched their commander return from the meeting that would end their struggle. His face revealed more sorrow than any man around him had ever seen. Grant, deeply moved by the encounter, issued an order preventing Union soldiers from celebrating. He understood that triumphal displays would only deepen wounds. The goal, he insisted, was peace, not spectacle. His decision reflected the same restraint he had shown in the meeting with Lee. He believed the nation could not heal if its returning soldiers were treated as enemies rather than fellow citizens. The next day, Confederate troops formally surrendered. Union officers accepted stacked rifles, folded flags, and the remnants of battle-worn uniforms. Many soldiers from both armies exchanged quiet glances. Some shook hands. Others shared rations or tobacco. Years of war had made them enemies, but the moment revealed a deeper truth. They were also Americans, shaped by the same land, the same hardships, and the same sense of duty. A deep stillness settled over the countryside as the Army of Northern Virginia disbanded. Men walked home in small groups or alone, heading toward farms, towns, and families they had not seen in years. Some returned to ruins. Others found loved ones who had waited anxiously for news. Many carried physical wounds. Others carried memories that would never fully fade. Friends lost, battles endured, and the immense weight of survival. The surrender at Appomattox did not end the war immediately. Other Confederate armies remained in the field, But the symbolic heart of the Confederacy had stopped beating. Within weeks, additional surrenders followed across the South. Generals Johnston, Kirby Smith, and others recognized the futility of continuing. By late spring, the war that had consumed the nation for 4 years had come to a quiet, gradual close. The meeting between Grant and Lee remains one of the most remarkable moments in American military history, not because of dramatic speeches or grand pageantry, but because of its humanity. Two men, shaped by different beliefs, met in a small, ordinary house and chose dignity over anger, compassion over destruction. Their decisions helped set the tone for the nation's long journey toward healing. The war's end brought relief, joy, confusion, and sorrow all at once. Families reunited, though some returned to empty homes. Communities began to rebuild. Newly freed African Americans stepped into uncertain but hopeful futures. Soldiers from both sides tried to resume lives forever altered by what they had seen. The surrender ended the conflict, but it also opened the door to the difficult process of reconstruction, a chapter filled with promise and struggle. Part 14. The Death of Lincoln. When the guns finally began to fall silent in the spring of 1865, many Americans allowed themselves to hope for the first time in 4 long years. Towns that had grown familiar with fear now heard only distant echoes of conflict. Soldiers returned home slowly, walking roads that still bore the marks of war. Families reunited, often through tears that mixed grief with relief. Across the North and the newly liberated South, a fragile sense of possibility spread. It was not yet joy, but it was the closest many had felt in years. At the center of this hopeful moment stood Abraham Lincoln. The president had carried the burdens of the war more heavily than most realized. His face, photographed through the years of conflict, showed deep lines and a tired gaze. He had absorbed the grief of thousands of families, the weight of battlefield failures, and the responsibility of decisions that shaped the nation's destiny. Yet when peace finally approached, those around him noticed a change. His shoulders seemed lighter. His expression grew softer. Even his voice took on a gentler tone. On April 9th, Lee surrendered at Appomattox. News spread quickly across the country. Crowds poured into streets, waving flags and embracing strangers. Church bells rang in towns large and small. Soldiers fired salutes. Newspapers printed joyful headlines. For the first time since 1861, people dared to imagine a future free from bloodshed. Lincoln celebrated cautiously. He knew the war was not completely finished. Other Confederate armies still remained in the field, but he believed the worst was finally over. In private conversations, he spoke about rebuilding the nation with mercy. He insisted that the South must return to the Union without humiliation. He talked of education, opportunity, and healing. His famous phrase, "with malice toward none, with charity for all," was more than a line from a speech. It reflected his deepest conviction that reconciliation, not revenge, must guide the country forward. In the days after the surrender, Washington transformed into a city of celebration. Fireworks illuminated the night sky. Brass bands played patriotic melodies. Flags hung from nearly every building. Lincoln appeared at a White House balcony to address cheering crowds. He spoke about Reconstruction, hinting at new rights for freedmen and new responsibilities for states returning to the Union. His ideas were forward-looking, gentle, and deeply rooted in the belief that unity must come from fairness. Yet even in this hopeful moment, danger lingered. Not everyone welcomed the end of the war with gratitude. Some Confederate loyalists felt anger instead of acceptance. They feared the changes emancipation would bring. They worried about the loss of status, property, and political power. Among them were men who believed Lincoln's vision threatened everything they valued. One such man was John Wilkes Booth. Booth, a well-known actor from a respected theatrical family, had long expressed sympathy for the Confederacy. He admired the Southern cause and despised Lincoln with a bitterness that grew more intense as the war drew to a close. He believed the president was responsible for the Confederacy's defeat and for destroying the world Booth romanticized. When he heard Lincoln speak about granting voting rights to some African American men, his anger hardened into a dangerous resolve. Booth decided Lincoln must die. On April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln spent the day in an unusually peaceful mood. Morning sunlight filtered softly into his office. He met with his cabinet, discussing the final steps needed to re-establish national unity. He visited with his son Tad, sharing stories and laughter. He rode through Washington with his wife Mary, speaking about life after the presidency. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future of rest, perhaps travel, perhaps quiet days spent away from the endless responsibilities of war. That evening, Lincoln planned to attend a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. The outing was meant to be a light-hearted escape, a moment to enjoy a city celebrating peace. Mary Lincoln, exhausted from years of anxiety, looked forward to the distraction. They invited several guests, though some declined due to illness or other obligations. In the end, the presidential box would be shared only with Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Booth knew the president would be there. As an actor familiar with Ford's Theater, he moved through its hallways with ease and confidence. He prepared carefully, planning his entrance, escape, and timing. He carried a small pistol and a knife, light, concealed, and deadly at close range. Several conspirators were meant to attack other members of Lincoln's cabinet, though most failed or lost their nerve. Booth alone remained committed. The evening unfolded unexpectedly calmly. The theater filled with cheerful patrons eager for entertainment. Laughter floated through the room as actors delivered humorous lines. When Lincoln entered, the audience rose to its feet in applause. He smiled, bowed slightly, and took his seat in the decorated presidential box. For a time, Lincoln seemed fully at ease. He watched the play with gentle amusement, occasionally whispering comments to Mary. Outside the box, music and laughter echoed through the theater, the sounds of a nation ready to breathe freely again. Shortly after 10 p.m., Booth made his move. He slipped into the hallway, approached the presidential box, and blocked the door behind him with a wooden bar he had prepared earlier. Inside, the actors on stage delivered one of the play's funniest lines, prompting a burst of loud laughter from the audience. In that moment of distraction, Booth stepped behind Lincoln and fired a single shot. The sound cracked through the box, though many in the audience mistook it for part of the play. Lincoln slumped forward, unconscious. Mary screamed. Major Rathbone lunged at Booth, but received a deep stab wound in the struggle. Booth leapt over the railing, landing awkwardly on stage. He raised a knife and shouted a Latin phrase, often remembered as sic semper tyrannis, meaning thus always to tyrants, and fled toward the back exit, disappearing into the night. The theater fell into chaos. Actors froze in shock. Audience members screamed. Soldiers rushed forward. Doctors were summoned. Within minutes, Lincoln was carried across the street to a nearby boarding house, the Peterson House. There, in a small back bedroom, doctors assessed the wound. The bullet had entered behind his left ear and lodged deep in his brain. They knew immediately that the injury was fatal. Lincoln never regained consciousness. Throughout the night, cabinet members, military leaders, and close friends gathered in the narrow room. The bed was too small for Lincoln's tall frame, so they placed him diagonally. Mary wept uncontrollably. Soldiers stood silently in the hallway. Outside, crowds gathered in anxious clusters, whispering prayers and waiting for updates. The night felt heavy, as though the entire country held its breath. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. The room fell silent. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had kept vigil through the night, watched the president's face settle into peaceful stillness. After a long pause, he spoke softly. "Now he belongs to the ages." News of Lincoln's death spread rapidly. Telegraph operators sent messages across the country. Newspapers printed special editions. In northern cities, church bells tolled throughout the day. Crowds gathered in public squares, many openly crying. Houses covered their windows with black cloth. Flags hung at half-mast. The nation that had celebrated victory days earlier now stood united in grief. Southern reactions varied. Some felt genuine sorrow. Others expressed muted relief. A few viewed Booth as a hero. But even among Confederate sympathizers, many recognized that Lincoln's death was a tragedy that would make reconciliation harder. They feared the policies of those who would follow him, men who lacked Lincoln's compassion and patience. Booth, meanwhile, fled on horseback, pursued by soldiers across forests, fields, and swamps. After nearly 2 weeks on the run, he was cornered in a barn in Virginia. When he refused to surrender, the barn was set on fire. A Federal soldier shot him, ending the hunt. Other conspirators were arrested and later executed or imprisoned. The plot, meant to revive the Confederate cause, only deepened the nation's wounds. Lincoln's funeral procession traveled from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, tracing a long route through cities where mourners lined the streets for miles. Thousands wept openly as the casket passed. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, entire communities stood in solemn silence. In the farms and small towns Lincoln once knew, people placed flowers along tracks, lit candles, or held simple ceremonies in his honor. The journey home became a symbolic farewell, not only to the man, but to the war itself. Lincoln had guided the nation through its darkest years. His death, arriving just as peace began, reminded Americans of the enormous cost of the conflict. It also left unanswered questions about what Reconstruction might have looked like under his leadership. When the funeral train finally reached Springfield, Lincoln was laid to rest among the familiar plains he had always called home. Crowds of mourners followed in long lines. Ministers spoke of his humility, his wisdom, and his unwavering commitment to preserving the Union. Newspapers described his burial as an event that united the country in a shared grief deeper than political division. Part 15. Rebuilding a Broken Nation. When the Civil War finally came to an end in the spring of 1865, the silence felt almost unfamiliar. For 4 years, the nation had lived inside the sound of marching boots, crackling gunfire, and distant cannon blasts. Suddenly, the air seemed still. Soldiers who had survived returned home slowly, moving through landscapes forever changed by battle. Families reunited, towns rebuilt, fields grew green again. Yet beneath the quiet surface lay scars that would take generations to heal. The task that followed the war, known as Reconstruction, was immense. Millions of people needed to rebuild their lives. Entire regions required new governments, new laws, and new systems of labor. Freedmen, newly emancipated men, women, and children, stepped into a world that promised freedom but offered no clear instructions on how to claim it. The South, physically devastated and economically strained, faced the challenge of redefining its identity without the institution that had shaped it for centuries. The North, weary from years of loss, struggled with the responsibility of guiding the country toward unity and fairness. And hovering over all of this was the absence of Abraham Lincoln. His vision for reconciliation had died with him. What came next would be shaped by different voices, some compassionate, others vengeful, many uncertain. In the weeks following the surrender at Appomattox, soldiers began making their way home. Their journeys varied widely. Some walked for miles with only a blanket and canteen. Others traveled by train or wagon. Many returned to farms that had been neglected or destroyed. Homes were in disrepair. Barns had collapsed. Fences had been burned for firewood. Fields were overgrown. The rhythm of ordinary life had been interrupted too long, and restoring it would be slow. Union veterans returned to towns brimming with relief. Parades greeted some regiments. Families prepared meals and decorated streets with flags. Yet even in the North, celebrations were tempered by grief. Nearly every community had lost someone: sons, brothers, fathers, husbands. Empty chairs waited in kitchens and parlors. Photographs hung on walls beside folded uniforms or letters carefully tied with ribbon. Victory had arrived, but at a cost measured in more than numbers. Confederate veterans faced different challenges. Their world had changed in ways difficult to grasp. Plantation owners returned to fields worked by new laborers or left untouched. Small farmers discovered barns empty and tools broken. Businesses that had once relied on enslaved labor or Confederate currency faced collapse. Many men returned to families surviving on little more than determination. Some carried bitterness. Others carried shame. A few carried a quiet hope that life might someday become normal again. The war had transformed the South's social structure entirely. Millions of formerly enslaved people were now free to move, free to work for themselves, free to build families without fear of separation, and free to imagine their futures. But freedom arrived without land, without money, and without guarantees. Families walked the roads searching for relatives sold away years before. Notices filled newspapers, lists of names, places, and descriptions of loved ones lost in the slave trade. Some reunions occurred. Many, heartbreakingly, did not. Freedmen faced choices none had imagined decades earlier. Should they stay on familiar plantations and work for wages? Should they travel north or west, seeking new opportunities? Should they join new communities forming in towns, cities, or rural enclaves? These decisions carried risks. White Southerners struggled to accept the end of slavery. Violence erupted in some regions. Laws were rewritten to restrict black movement, employment, and political power. Freed families had to navigate this turbulent world carefully. The federal government stepped in to help with the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865. The agency provided food, helped reunite families, negotiated labor contracts, and supported the building of new schools across the South. Teachers, black and white, northern and southern, opened classrooms in churches, barns, and abandoned buildings. Children who once learned in secret now practiced letters openly. Adults attended night classes, eager to read, write, and claim rights denied to them for generations. Education became one of the most powerful tools of Reconstruction, giving freedmen a voice that many Southerners feared. Meanwhile, in Washington, leadership shifted abruptly after Lincoln's assassination. Andrew Johnson, who became president, approached Reconstruction with a very different philosophy. He sought rapid reunification and offered generous pardons to former Confederate leaders. He prioritized restoring Southern governments quickly, often without ensuring that the new systems protected black rights. Many Northern lawmakers felt his policies betrayed the sacrifices of the war. They feared the South would recreate a society that, while no longer based on slavery, still oppressed its black citizens. Conflict between Johnson and Congress grew fierce. Lawmakers passed civil rights legislation designed to protect the rights of freedmen. Johnson vetoed many of these bills. Congress overrode several of his vetoes, the first time in American history such power had been used repeatedly. The struggle revealed deep divisions within the country, even after victory. Reconstruction also brought the question of voting. Should freedmen vote? Should former Confederates be barred from office? Radical Republicans argued that black men deserved immediate political rights. They believed full citizenship was necessary to protect freed families from exploitation or violence. Many white Southerners disagreed fiercely, asserting that political participation should remain restricted. The debate shaped the next decade, influencing everything from state constitutions to federal laws. In 1868, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States, including former slaves. 2 years later, the 15th Amendment prohibited states from denying the right to vote based on race. These amendments promised a future of equality, on paper at least. The South responded with resistance. Reconstruction governments included black legislators for the first time in American history. Farmers, teachers, preachers, and veterans who advocated for schools, infrastructure, and fair labor laws. Their service marked a profound transformation of Southern democracy. Yet these achievements sparked backlash. White supremacist groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, emerged to terrorize black citizens and anyone who supported Reconstruction. Nighttime raids, threats, and violence filled rural areas. The Klan burned schools, attacked teachers, and hid behind hoods to avoid accountability. Despite these dangers, freed families continued moving forward. They built churches that became centers of community life. They organized businesses, barbershops, bakeries, tailor shops, and small farms. They contributed to local governments. They wrote memoirs, sermons, and speeches. Their determination shaped the Southern landscape in ways that remained visible long after Reconstruction officially ended. Rebuilding physical infrastructure presented another enormous challenge. Railroads damaged during the war needed repair. Bridges required reconstruction. Rivers clogged with debris had to be cleared. Cities like Richmond, Charleston, and Atlanta faced years of rebuilding. Many structures that stood before the war had vanished, burned, shelled, or abandoned. Roads were muddy, unpaved, and worn from years of troop movement. Rebuilding took patience, labor, and money that the South struggled to find. Meanwhile, in thousands of homes across both regions, families attempted to return to a sense of normalcy. Mothers who had lived in fear of telegrams now busied themselves with household routines. Children who had grown up with war at their doorstep played in yards, attended school, and listened to stories of battles they were too young to understand. Veterans tried to resume work, though many carried injuries that shaped their daily lives. Missing limbs, chronic pain, or memories of trauma followed them into peacetime, often unspoken but deeply felt. Northern communities faced their own challenges. They needed jobs for returning soldiers. They needed pensions for widows and orphans. They needed to support veterans leaving military hospitals with long-term injuries. They also needed to adjust to the influx of freed families moving north in search of opportunity. Factories grew more quickly. Cities expanded. Some neighborhoods transformed almost overnight. Despite all these efforts, the emotional healing took far longer than the physical. Both sides carried resentment. Many Southerners believed Reconstruction was punishment. Many Northerners felt the South had not learned the true cost of rebellion. Former slaves, newly free yet frequently threatened, struggled for basic rights. The country walked a thin line between progress and relapse. Through the 1870s, Reconstruction governments worked to rebuild the South and protect civil rights. These efforts succeeded in many areas. Schools grew, infrastructure returned, and black political participation increased, but opposition intensified. Economic downturns fueled racial tension. Northern interest in Reconstruction waned. By 1877, federal troops withdrew from the South as part of a political compromise. Without their protection, many reforms collapsed. Southern lawmakers introduced new restrictions designed to suppress black voting and maintain white supremacy. These laws would shape the next century. Still, the legacies of Reconstruction endured. The amendments passed during this era laid the foundation for future civil rights movements. The communities built by freed families remained strong anchors of culture and identity. The promise of equality, though delayed, challenged, and resisted, continued to influence the nation's conscience. Reconstruction eventually gave way to a period historians call the New South, marked by industrial growth, expanding railroads, and new industries. But the shadows of the war lingered. Memorials appeared in cemeteries and town squares. Veterans' reunions became annual events. Writers published memoirs recalling moments of bravery, fear, and sorrow. The war shaped literature, art, and memory long after the last shots were fired. Families passed stories through generations, some bittersweet, others deeply painful. Grandchildren listened to tales of battles, marches, and the long walk home from Appomattox. They learned about courage, sacrifice, and belief. They also learned about mistakes, cruelty, and the consequences of division. These memories, carried in quiet conversations and old photographs, shaped how the nation understood itself. Over time, the United States moved forward, but the Civil War remained a touchstone, a reminder of the cost of division, the dangers of hatred, and the power of courage. It taught the country that freedom requires protection, that unity requires effort, and that dignity must extend to all people, regardless of race or background. The war had torn the nation apart. Reconstruction tried to stitch it back together. The process was imperfect, but the direction it pointed toward, a more equal and unified nation, remained one of the most important legacies of the era.